It's 1:30, so we'll get started with the cryptocurrency presentation and training. For those of you who are interested in the continuing education credits that come attached to this session from the Digital Currency Council, when we've concluded, if you'll step to the desk out front, certificates are available for you to verify your attendance. Thank you, everybody, for coming. We appreciate it very much. Hopefully this will be a useful and interesting presentation for you. It's very broad-based. It's going to start from a very high level. Those of you who are familiar with cryptocurrency and Bitcoin, please be patient with some of the tedium as we go over some of the basics, but as the other panelists come through their more detailed and focused information, I think there'll be lots of items to cherry pick from and to help advance your understanding of what's going on here. My name is Tony Ficara. I'm a director with Wildcard Payments. Our panelists are Judd Bagley with Overstock.com, Travis Delaney, CEO of Wildcard Payments, Chris DeRose with the Counterparty Foundation, and Robert Mao with McKinsey & Company. So let's get started. This is a quote from Satoshi Nakamoto, which is not the real name. Nobody really knows who the actual individual is who created Bitcoin. That's the name he assumed. And this was one of his first statements on the essence of Bitcoin and cryptocurrency. An interesting way to start, I think, and certainly it kind of speaks to the dynamic and open nature of where cryptocurrencies are and where they're going in the future. And the difficulty, in fact, in sort of integrating them and understanding them into the mainstream financial world. So, as I said, let's start with some very high-level basics for those who are less familiar with what we're talking about, so that we're all kind of talking the same language. So first, let's just understand fiat currency as opposed to cryptocurrency. A fiat is a command or an act of will. Basically, a sovereign government declares that a currency is its national currency, and that simply makes it so. A currency is only legally valid by declaration, if you will, at least in the mainstream. So the US dollar is the US currency because the US government says it is. If it said it was something else, it would be something else. That's the essence of a fiat. Fiat currencies are issued and backed by sovereign nations. They carry legal tender status, and they are always managed by a central authority with unilateral control over the money supply. The authority can print and destroy money to affect the value of the currency and make further changes as they see fit. Now, an alternative currency is typically established by a local community's consent. There are actually hundreds and hundreds of them. Some are not necessarily cryptocurrencies, but they do exist in various places throughout the world. They typically operate in parallel with a fiat currency. And they have limited reach as valid tender because they are only going to be valid within the small community that accepts them. And they have no legal status. Here's some examples you can see in the Berkshires of Massachusetts. They use a currency called Berkshares. Disney has their Disney dollars, etc. Now, cryptocurrency in and of itself is a subset of what we'd call alternate currencies. They are specifically defined by the use of cryptography to secure transactions and to create new currency units. There's often no printed or minted medium of any sort. Bitcoin is an excellent example. There are no actual coins. There are some little toy souvenirs that are manufactured, but there is not actually a tangible product that you can carry in your physical wallet. They're purely digital. There's usually a set of publicly understood rules for their creation. And the concepts actually of mutual distrust and open accounting are intended to keep the system honest. That is, within a cryptocurrency, there's typically a mechanism by which persons and entities outside of the transaction have a function in validating the transactions. And there's no central controlling authority. They exist, if you will, in the wild. Essentially, cryptocurrencies began about 1998 as an academic exercise in the creation of something called B-money. Bitgold came thereafter, invented by a gentleman named Nick Szabo. Bitcoin itself was created in 2009 as the first fully decentralized, truly functioning cryptocurrency system. There are hundreds, and I spent some time trying to get a hard number, and there isn't one. There's just a lot of guesswork. There are hundreds and hundreds of derivative and clone cryptocurrencies since Bitcoin, and most of them have some similarities, if somewhat diluted, to Bitcoin. There have been very few other arguable successes at best, and very few new technical innovations since Bitcoin was released. Now, I want to cover a couple of essentials of how Bitcoin works, again, just for background and understanding. Bitcoin, at its very heart, is based on a cryptographic hash function as part of the proof of work scheme. In this case, the function used is called SHA-256, and it was created by the NSA. That interesting image there is a logical map that I simply cannot explain to you, that somehow creates a visual image of how this hash function works. I thought it would be interesting to see, although I doubt any of us, although there may be one surprise somewhere here in the audience, really could explain that, but that's how logically it works if you're trained in that kind of...
Chris can.
Chris probably could, yes. But what I want you to understand is how one works, because that backs into some of the other really core fundamentals of Bitcoin and what makes it what it is. So if you'll think for a moment about a very simple sort of a child's game that a lot of us would have played maybe back in school with simple codes, a simple replacement code, A equals 1, B equals 2, C equals 3, right? And you write out, the quick brown fox jumped over the lazy dog, and the teachers, I don't like them. And you convert each letter into a number, and you pass it to your friend behind you, and they decrypt it backwards. Now, what happens with a simple replacement function like that is if you change a single character and you recode the original message, it's the same output with the exception of that one character. I change an A to a B, and one character in the output goes from a 1 to a 2. Now, with a hash function, and this image helps to lay it out for you, with a hash function, if you change a single character within the original message that you're going to encode, it changes the entire output. Whether it's a single word or an entire text, you can't change any element without completely changing the output. Notice the differences here that you can see. Right? Let's look at the third example down. I don't know if you can quite make out the highlight that's actually there, but in that word after jumps, O-U-E-R, right? We've changed the V to a U. But notice the difference from the second to third outputs. We have one alphanumeric character that's changed, but the entire output is different. That's very significant because it's part of why it's so difficult to invade the blockchain, the central ledger, if you will, of Bitcoin. Is this explanation making basic sense to everyone? Okay. It's a very highly complex process, and its inherent security is in this basic fact that the smallest change gives you a dramatic change in output. So reversing, decrypting, is extremely difficult. At its heart, essentially, is really a set of rules. They're encoded into a computer program and are intended to create and manage the supply of digital currency. Bitcoin was created with a fixed maximum. There will only ever be 21 million Bitcoin ever mined. Their value will change with the value assigned by the market, the people who choose to own and exchange them. But the total number will never change, which is absolutely at odds with fiat currency, as we all know. Bitcoin themselves, the units are created by a process called mining, which is a computationally heavy process of solving these SHA-256 equations. It takes a great deal of computing power to mine for Bitcoin. And the solutions that are created by a miner have to be validated by the community in order to ultimately validate and approve the creation of that unit. The code that manages the Bitcoin environment and the mining of it is open source, so anyone who chooses to is free to see it. My understanding, at least the last time that I did this research, and keep in mind, folks, there's a lot of places to question and contravene what sound like statements of fact, because Bitcoin is so dynamic and literally, and Chris can speak excellently to this, it changes so fast that I'm sure he'll pick some holes in some of the things that I've said because they were true last week, but they're not true today. The code language is considered by some to be quite esoteric and a bit difficult to understand if you're not really an expert in it. And the volunteer community that surrounds Bitcoin patch and improve the code over time, but those changes are always in view of the rest of the community and subject to group validation. All transactions, furthermore, are in full view of the community. And the transactions and the creation of units are validated over and over and over again. This is fundamentally different from fiat currencies, which base all of their validity on the fiat of a sovereign government. By the way, folks, this is really meant to be a very interactive sort of a thing, so if anything comes across that you're not familiar with or you don't understand, please just wave your hand, or if you have something else to input, please do be a part of it and wave your hand or shout or throw something at me.
What is the code language?
Mostly C, straight vanilla C, Boost as a library.
Okay. The very core of Bitcoin is the blockchain. Let's talk about what that is. The blockchain is a public transaction database shared by all nodes in the Bitcoin system protocol. The blockchain is the general ledger of each and every Bitcoin transaction that has ever occurred. That has ever occurred. A full copy contains all the transactions ever executed. Each block contains a hash of the previous block. Remember the hash function we talked about. So what happens is that each block, which is a set of transactions, validated transactions, is coded into the blockchain like another link in the chain, but its encoding is based on the previous valid block. Because of the way a hash function works, like we talked about a few moments ago, therefore you can't get into the blockchain to change ledger entries after the fact. Now you can do that in a lot of other kind of financial databases if you have access. You can get into the paper ledger and erase an entry and change it to something else and monkey with all the numbers going forward. That's essentially not something you can do with Bitcoin because of the nature of how the blockchain grows and how it's coded to the previous block. And they're all coded back to what's called the Genesis block, the very first one. Any change made to the past, were that possible, would invalidate everything forward of it, so it's immediately visible.
So let me just share a thought. And this is when I was first learning about Bitcoin. One of the things that I first came to this realization of kind of what the blockchain is. And you can listen to some of this, and if you're on the business side or if you're on the technical side, it depends on how you see it, right? So a lot of times the blockchain, I've always referred it to as the big P&L in the sky. But if you think about it, that's really what it amounts to. It's a series of transactions, inputs and outputs to some extent. They're being validated that they're correct. And so they're picking up on the previous balance and then continues on. But it has to match, right? So a lot of times I do that type of correlation because it helps relate it instead of being this abstract thing out there in the, on the internet, that's this digital thing and how it works. So, I've always had this thing of how does that relate to what works today that I understand, right? So if you think about it and relate it to a financial ledger, and in essence, that's what it amounts to. It's the big P&L for everything that's ever transacted. Every transaction's there, inputs and outputs, everything is right there, and it's all been validated, and then they have to all tie together. Anything you want to add to that, Chris?
Yeah, the important thing to realize about Bitcoin is that energy plays a huge role in the function. Blocks themselves are adhered to each other by way of burning energy, and the miners burn energy to create what's functionally a glue through these hashes, and that glue adheres each block to the next. And in this way, they can't actually be tampered without creating, without needing an equal amount of energy in order to separate the block from the chain. And this is also an aggregate process. So to go back into the chain, it requires as much energy as was expended to get you there in the first place. If you want to go back 3 blocks, you have to burn substantially more energy. It's a bit exotic, but that function is important to understand. It's, at least in my mind, the most important part of the innovation that is Bitcoin, and the reason why we're here. The reason why is because you can't change data. And the reason you can't change data is because miners burn energy to assert that truth, to create the glue that sticks it together.
When you say energy, what do you mean?
Quite literally, miners plug into the electrical outlet and run a calculation that burns energy. It destroys value, it costs you money. It's, in my mind, an economic function. There's a lot of computer science at work, but that component of the process is mostly an economic innovation. I expect that you will see at some point some very smart people who probably invent some new form of game theory or something like that having to do with the economic functions that work there.
So you'll see a little bit, sorry Tony, what you'll see, there's one of the things that makes Bitcoin and every cryptocurrency has its unique attributes, but one of the things that Bitcoin, there's a merging of different viewpoints, perspectives, beliefs, right? So, Chris brings up the energy burn, which is it actually takes money and energy to produce and to calculate and validate. That's what the miners do. And then there's a green side of that, right? Because it's energy, right? And then there's a element of decentralization, which you hear a lot about libertarian viewpoints or anti-governmental type of aspects because it is decentralized. There's no government control. And then there's an element of payments and exchange of value. And so you'll see that's the reason why we have this very interesting panel that we've assembled between the retail sector of Overstock to kind of the outsider analyst aspect from McKinsey, the coder and the from Chris's viewpoint from the technology standpoint, and then myself from the payment standpoint, from a history of understanding of exchange of value for somebody that grew up in the world of prepaid where it was stored value in essence. So go ahead.
It's probably worth talking about the reputation of Bitcoin and where it came from, and like the common belief that it's for illegal purchases or anonymous purchases and all these things. That's largely a misconception, and mostly because like Silk Road and some of the ways in which Bitcoin kind of got its name and became popular, illegal transactions, because of what's up here on the screen, if you do an illegal transaction with Bitcoin or a cryptocurrency, that's actually a huge mistake. You've just made a record of that transaction that never goes away. So if I'm the FBI or somebody like that, that's great, right? Because they can track those transactions. It's not anonymous, it's pseudonymous, so all I've got to do is break kind of the pseudonym of the username that you used in there. And the reason why these things were used early on in things like Silk Road is because a fiat currency can be rejected or declined, or a government can stop the transaction. Whereas, Bitcoin or a cryptocurrency, there's no central organizing body to say, hey, you can't buy heroin with this currency. And so that's where it becomes kind of the easiest way, or the accepted way to do an illegal transaction. And I think you've largely seen that shift. And there's a question over here we'll take first. And then
what about the Tumblr websites that are supposed to be extra layers of anonymization for Bitcoins?
Yeah, you could probably answer that.
So I'm wearing a hat that says fungible on it. It's one of the biggest issues right now in the movement is this notion of fungibility. I usually pick hats that are topically relevant, in our own little community. This notion of what is fungible typically applied to currencies in the past in very different ways. What it means in the context of Bitcoin, though, is in fact anonymity. And there's a lot of discussion right now going over that. There are many ways to obfuscate identity, and it is a pseudonymous mechanism. And to a certain degree, users get to choose the fungibility that they want in their transaction. And fungibility is some degree of anonymity on the spectrum. And similarly, law enforcement gets to choose how much energy they put into deobfuscating. So this is a constantly evolving issue. The core developers are pretty committed to keeping Bitcoin as anonymous as they can, with the option to be less anonymous. Whether or not that plays out, we don't know. This is part of the sort of risk profile of all the people involved in Bitcoin. But tumblers, more specific to your question, are one such feature in that spectrum, which allow people to further obfuscate their identity by setting up pools of actors that are similarly inclined to obfuscate their transactions and creating, entropy would be the word for it, but creating more anonymity and more obfuscation in their transaction. So it's on that spectrum, and users typically opt into how much anonymity they want, and similarly law enforcement opts into how much auditing they want to do.
Yeah, and tumblers have been cracked, and there's been convictions of events that have taken place through a tumbler that been described. So.
Yeah, Chainalysis, I believe, is one company you can look into. If you like that issue, Chainalysis talks a lot about this, and they have software that will show you statistical probabilities of source and destination, alongside a lot of other information in between. And Coinbase as well has, I forgot the software they use. I've seen this through somebody else. They have tools that are fully dedicated to this. This is becoming a small industry.
Yeah, and anonymity is ultimately challenged just through federal regulations and laws around anti-money laundering and know your customer. So it's really difficult for a big bank to play in this space, or even Coinbase or somebody else for that matter, without breaking the veil of like what's your pseudonym versus what's your true identity. All right, so there are a couple more questions.
Yeah, so you had mentioned Silk Road. What about Agora? I know Agora's chosen to kind of go offline now based off of a couple things. But you said that you're talking about mixers and tumblers. So there is a way to follow that, follow the blockchain, or follow the transaction through the blockchain like that?
So this is a small industry. There are people that are using tumblers. These tumblers are obfuscation tools. And you can go to like Reddit slash Darknet Markets, I believe, our Darknet Markets, and you can read up on all of the tools that are available. Similarly, you can follow companies like Chainalysis that are working on the other end of the spectrum. I will say that to the end, like specifically of Agora or these markets, what we see, I think, right now is very similar to what we saw with Napster in the 90s, where there was a new market that was essentially created that was at first, I think, centralized by one company, Napster in that case, and then is now becoming less and less unitary. You now have all of these torrent sites that have effectively replaced it. That's what's probably going on with Silk Road. Agora is one such site in that system, and it's highly probable that that entirety of those markets will be completely decentralized, I believe, at some point. We shall see how that ends up, but there's a lot of people that are working to do that. It's a very controversial thing. And back to what we were saying before about politics, I was a developer all my life doing things that were very non-controversial. I got into Bitcoin because technically it amazed me, and then I found myself in the middle of this gigantic political battle, basically, between all kinds of people, ideas, etc. Bitcoin's wonderful and it's important, and there's so much at stake that you see these major issues are being fought out online and in places like this, and it's actually kind of part of the fun, I think. Personally, I try to stay out of a lot of the sort of, what's the word, I don't know, judgmental perhaps part of what's good or bad. Mostly I try to understand what's going on, that's from my angle. So I can tell you most of about those things, but yeah.
But as far as Bitcoin and the blockchain, isn't the blockchain just so big so that more and more transactions that come through that blockchain slows it down?
So yes and no, there are ways of proving the blockchain. Particularly when monetary velocity is high, there are certain transactions you don't need. So you can run, there are lots of levers in Bitcoin. There are levers for fungibility. It's a lever, it goes all the way up, all the way down, and depending on what the opportunity costs are, you set it where you want it. Similarly, with the block size and what you retain, you can choose to retain all of it, as is the case with these block explorers, blocktrail.com, blockchain.info, or if you're just running a small wallet, you can choose only the transactions that apply to you. And then there are options in the middle, and so depending on what your needs are, there's some availability on that spectrum of where you'll be serviced.
Which would actually go on to say, depending on the product or the offering will depend on what they decide to set it at and whether or not they're tracking adequately, right? So if you think about, in the traditional sense of payments, there's certain regulatory controls and rules that we follow to identify source of funds or destination in some cases. And we do that because there's a regulatory environment or an audit that we would be under scrutiny to provide clarity to, right? And so that's an element of the regulatory side of things that we'll get into, that why this becomes important, and regulatory is actually a component. It is important to manage that so we have an understanding of clarity. You can elect to or not to, depending on what you do. Just like if you elect to do certain types of payments, you have to have an MSB. If you don't, then you do something different, right? So I want to make sure we stay on track a little bit, but one of the things that it's interesting, because this conversation is, Chris and I had a conversation from the airport, and I said I'll use it, but I'll give him credit for it. He made a comment, he goes, it's like Bitcoin's like gold, kind of digital gold. And he goes, and when there's gold, there's going to be pirates. And so it's a funny thing, because these come up in every single discussion I've ever had. So what about, the bad side, the dark net and everything else? And how many times does that happen with currency today? You just don't know it. Right? So the difference is it's more trackable now. It's in the media, so you're more aware of it. But let me tell you, it's been happening since the day of time. And it just depends on the exchange of value that happened. You just didn't know about it. So, this actually gives us, to Chris's point, a much more trackability to identify some of that bad behavior. Right? So this, we each have sections that we're specialized on certain topics, but I don't want to lose our timing issue either.
Okay. Let's just sum up this and move along. We'll actually touch on a number of these items that have just come up in conversation, so we'll revisit them again, I'm sure, in a little bit more detail. But in summary, let's just breeze through this. Each block is guaranteed, in each block in the blockchain, again, the general ledger of transactions, is guaranteed to come chronologically after the last one, because you couldn't encode it properly without knowing the hash of the prior block. And the chain itself is only valid if every prior component in it is valid, and that has to track all the way back to the Genesis block. It's considered computationally impractical to modify a block, because all subsequent ones would have to be modified as well. You'd end up with a branch, a parallel branch, as well as the investment in actual costly effort. A mining rig is not a typical desktop computer anymore. It's a highly specialized, very expensive device that requires a great deal of power, electrical energy, to run, and usually there are multiples of them. And as Chris alluded to, it becomes a capital investment, substantial capital investment, in order to be a miner. It might not have been the case back in the day at the beginning, but now the amount of effort taken required to process through the next block means a significant dollar investment in doing so. So you don't, if a Bitcoin is worth $1,000 today, by the time you're done mining one successfully, you don't have $1,000 in profit. You have substantially less because of the capital investment and the operating expenses involved in just running these algorithms long enough to be successful, or to their successful conclusion. So mining, which we've been talking about, the process of creating Bitcoin. Three things happen. Transactions are verified. Those verified transactions are added to the blockchain, and when that's done successfully, someone gets a new Bitcoin, or a portion of one. Coded into the system is a halving of production with each subsequent year since inception. So it becomes even more difficult year after year. Translate difficult into a larger capital and operating investment in mining. And so it necessarily narrows the field of willing and available miners. Maximum 21 million Bitcoins can ever be produced, and the algorithm ensures that cap mathematically. No one can change that.
Let me bring up a topic about mining a minute. Mining is interesting because I want to, again, mining is one of those things when you first come to mine, you get this little idea, the little yellow guy with a yellow hat on and with a pick or something. And maybe they had some relevance to that originally. But, mining is in essence the validation of, I call them the accountants of that big P&L as I was referring to, right? They validate that everything is a true and correct transaction. Now, they're competing in essence to he who gets there first and validates that transaction gets the reward, which is a piece of a Bitcoin, which is the return on investment, if you will, for their capital and energy spend. But there's a discussion about mining in general that's worth us talking about. And I like Chris to kind of expand on this a little bit, but mining is a critical piece of validation, and that's part of the blockchain. Without a miner really is nothing more than a series of transactions that have been recorded. And so you need that third-party validation that, if I did something, you validated that I actually did that, right? And so then that's where you get that consensus, and that's part of the kind of the secret behind what Bitcoin brings and the blockchain brings. But when you look at it, there's been discussion about, well, who are those people? Can I trust those people? Or how many are there? And there's discussion about, a couple of them that do the majority of all the validations and all the mining. So what happens if they go down? What happens if it gets too expensive and they can't sustain themselves? So what does happen, Chris?
Right, so mining is a very well-calibrated part of the process, and it's also the most misunderstood. It's a bit controversial too, and I can get to that in a second, but mining is very well calibrated to do a number of things. First and foremost, it automatically balances out the probabilities on the network for who gets Bitcoin based on the amount of energy that is burned by the participants, roughly. The cost on the total, the aggregate amount of mining per day is itself very closely tuned to the price of Bitcoin. If Bitcoin is, right now we're producing 25 Bitcoin every 10 minutes. It works out to a little bit under $1 million a year. So let's say it's per day, excuse me. So if it's $800,000 per day Bitcoin that are mined, the cost to mine it will be something just short of that, maybe $790,000 or so. That spread, that delta, is what the miners make in profit over their energy and capital goods costs and such. It is a lagging indicator. People drop in and drop out, so it does tend to change. It's a sufficiently deep market, and it's a commoditized service, which means that anybody can do it. It does favor a certain economy of scale, which is itself kind of controversial. But this process has been going on for a while, and it's worth noting that people don't like mining because it burns energy. They see that as wasteful. And there are alternative proposals on the table to replace the energy mining that we do now with a voting system. I don't like those proposals. There are some that do like those, and there's very technical reasons why I don't like those. But the actual cost of losing value is itself what aligns the economic incentives and the statistical incentives of asserting truth on the Bitcoin network. And it is very well tuned. It's been running well by and large since 2009. And a thing that people don't realize about Bitcoin is there's a lot of risk in Bitcoin. We don't know that the system will keep on running forever. It's looking really good. When you see the price at what it is and you see it going down and being very volatile, all that risk is baked into that price. Every 10 minutes, roughly, it seems like the network is still working. And it's a heartbeat, and we wait to see when the next block comes. And that every time that block comes, that is a testament to the validity of the network. It's kind of the test that every 10 minutes the network goes through as to whether or not the economic incentives are lining up. But thus far, it's worked out pretty well.
Once the 21 million are reached, what's the incentive to validate the block?
Right, so right now the miners are working for block rewards. The actual process of producing a block creates itself a genesis of money. Right now it's 25 Bitcoin. They can write a check against the balance that is that block that is in their name. Now, as time goes on, that goes from 25 Bitcoin to 12 and a half. I think that happens mid next year, like June of next year. Then like 3 or 4 years later, it goes from 12 and a half to 5.75, whatever the halving is, every year thereafter. And over time, we'll eventually get from zero down to very fractional amounts down to zero. At that point, there will be no more money coming in from that process. So the question is, what do they do at that point? In addition to the actual costs, the rewards from mining, the innate rewards, people who use the Bitcoin network pay the miners tips. Those tips are an anti-spam mechanism, and the person who pays the most is the person who is most likely to get into the block. There's a finite amount of space in every block, so if we have 1 million transactions that want to go into the block, and there's only room for 500,000, whoever has the biggest tips are the ones to get in. The numbers are actually 120,000 per day. I don't know what that comes out to be per block. It's roughly like 7 transactions per second, I think, maybe 4, something like that. And it is expected that the profits from tipping will displace the reward for mining. Now, will that happen? We don't know. That this gets into the every 10 minutes or so the network is tested. Thus far, we've been good. We have had once. It used to be 50 Bitcoin per block, and then in, I think, November of 13, that went down. And at that time, it was very, again, everybody in the movement was waiting to see what would happen. The whole thing would fail, or the whole thing would go to the moon. And it went to the moon, not as a result of that, but incidentally around that same time. That was when the big price spike kind of happened. That had more to do with other factors, probably. But we shall see the next time the halving day comes. That is one of the things that's tested every couple of years, is how are we going to scale going forward in this incentive structure.
Moving along, okay. As has already been alluded to, during the mining process, transactions are occurring all the time, and they're recorded for the blockchain record to keep track. All the transactions during a fixed period of time are collected into a list called the block. We're kind of going deep into it and then coming back to the basics and then going back deep, so just bear with, right? But essentially that's what a block is all the transactions recorded within a fixed period of time. And the mining process also, as we've talked about, confirms the transactions. Once validated, adds the block to the blockchain, which functions as Bitcoin's universal general ledger. Now, just for the moment, and I'm sure we'll revisit this again over the time we've got together, but keep in mind, think about that as a comparative to mainstream banking. The essence, the idea of an open, publicly viewable general ledger of all transactions. It does not exist in the current system. That's a very interesting thought starter, in my opinion. The fundamental difference between a series of closed proprietary databases, each recording their own transactions and sharing information about those transactions under very specific circumstances, versus the universality of a general ledger that records absolutely everything for anyone to look at the books at any time. I think that's very important to consider. Myths and misunderstandings. This is kind of amusing part. This will be a little bit light, and we've touched on a number of them, and you've already heard some commentary from the panelists. One myth is that the use of Bitcoin is anonymous. Well, as we've already heard said, and I'm about to say again, nope, it's not. It appears that way. It provides a certain degree of it, but it is not actually an uncrackable, purely anonymous system. Transactions are not necessarily personally identified with personal data, like names, but accounts can, with effort, be traced back to wallets and IP addresses. This was, in fact, in an oversimplified way, how the authorities tracked back to the Silk Road case and to Ross Ulbricht by eventually matching transactions and IP addresses to his own personal laptop. While he was denying he was involved, it was identifiable. This is actually, in some very important ways, different from cash transactions. Cash is just cash, unless you're holding it in your hand or it's in an identifiable place that's associated with you. It's not otherwise trackable in the same sense. Oh no, criminals use Bitcoin. This one I just have no patience for this particular argument, because if you turn on the news tonight, you're almost inevitably going to see a criminal arrest of some size with a bunch of, with a photo op and some words spoken, and in the back will be a pallet of cash. So nothing exists that a criminal, that criminal intent can't abuse. So to argue that Bitcoin or cryptocurrency is somehow unsafe or invalid because of that, I believe personally is a fool's notion. If you don't like the idea that criminals use things to enact their criminal intent, we'd have to wipe out quite a lot of our lives to remove those things, starting with fiat cash. I don't think that makes any sense. It's simply not a valid argument, in my opinion. And I believe I'm not alone. Some have claimed or been concerned that Bitcoin is illegal because it's not legal tender. That's not entirely true. FinCEN itself has actually classified Bitcoin as a virtual currency. It does not make it legal tender, but it does not make it illegal to transact with, right? If I want to trade you my lawnmower for your bicycle, that's not an illegal transaction, and there is no fiat currency necessarily involved. Another argument, Bitcoin enables tax evasion. Well, again, fiat cash has been used for centuries to do exactly that, keeping in mind the taxes have involved for, well, millennia, actually. And I'm sure you can go back to the ancient Sumerians and find more than one individual who was carefully burying part of his income to keep the king's tax man away from it. So again, it's one of those arguments that on the surface has something valid to it, but because of its universal, the argument is universal across any kind of currency transaction. So I don't believe that it's valid to argue specifically against this kind of currency transaction based on that. And as Chris alluded to, and we've mentioned Silk Road a couple of times, authorities have been able, when necessary, to track back to identifiable information and identify culprits successfully and prosecute them successfully. Prosecuting them for trafficking in illegal goods is not fundamentally different from tracking them for tax evasion, another illegal act. I saw a question?
So yeah, I just want to highlight something you and others said several times now is flaws in Bitcoin is no different than flaws in the fiat currency. I mean, the flaws are there. But my question there is that there's a huge infrastructure, the whole establishment after the fiat currency to fix those flaws, to try to find solutions over the time. Who's backing Bitcoin in that aspect?
That's a very good point, actually. One of the open fields, and it will come up, I think, in pretty extensive discussion as we go on here, is how cryptocurrencies, and Bitcoin in particular, may or may not evolve within a regulatory environment. My personal opinion is that, like anything else in our existence, people like to argue the extremes. Must have regulation, I hate regulation, and stick it to the man, and government is evil. But the reality, I think, of our lives is going to fall into the middle.
Let me add to this. So your question is really around, you know, there's Bitcoin over here, and then there's fiat over here, and fiat is regulated, and we have all these other ways of managing that, but we don't Bitcoin, right? You know, there is an evolution of including Bitcoin and what is considered to be regulated and what's not. You know, the New York State bit license, New Jersey, and a number of other states are looking to write some regulation around what you can and can't do, what licenses you need, and things of that nature, right? And so, let's face it, the regulatory environment is always about 5 years behind innovation. That's just, yeah, exactly. I'm trying to be conservative or nice in that respect. So that respect, there's always a behind the scenario, right? And this kind of like right along the line with Chris and I's conversation from the airport is that, you know, you have what people like to call themselves disruptive activities or efforts, and it evokes change, right? And you know, Chris asked me a question. It was interesting. He goes, well, why didn't anybody ever change before? because nobody was challenging it, because everybody was able to, okay with the status quo and the age-old thing of it's not fixed, don't broke it. So, we've been doing the same old payments thing for a good 40 years for the most part. Big innovation we had, 10 some odd years ago was PayPal, or prepaid for that matter. Those were big innovations. Those were disruptors for their time frame. Well, if you think about Bitcoin, it's really a form of stored value. So how's prepaid different? And then when they wrote the Bitcoin license, they figured that out. Wallets, bank accounts, it's all the same stuff. It's just an account with a value stored to it. It just happens to be digital, right? So my argument and my comment back to you is that why is it here and here? Why isn't it just an extension of what we do today, right? And so me being a payments guy, I look at it as what can it be? I look at it as, we talk about this blockchain, we talk about these things, and Tony's here to make sure that we dispel those silly, stupid stuff that people hear. I can't believe how many times I've actually had somebody ask me, oh, I thought Bitcoin went out of business. Excuse me? That Mt. Gox thing, didn't he get arrested? It's like, you'd be surprised. It's just lack of understanding, right? And so that's part of what we're here to do is clarify some of those things. But it's about what it can be, right? And we each have these different segments to talk about what it can be. But if you think about it, I'm a product guy. I look at it as what it can be and look at the transactional side. Is there gaps in an enemy, and is there gaps of source of the understanding today? Yeah, absolutely. But our job is to take that and create what it can be, like we did everything else so far.
I think your point is very valid. If you look at it here and here, it's hard to sustain that. But when you mash it in, that's where you have some room.
Exactly.
Right.
Exactly.
And the point I was driving at was going there too, is that what I believe the Bitcoin community needs to do for itself, if it wants to see Bitcoin succeed, is to divest itself of the early stages of this sort of flag-waving anarchist kind of view, and realize that real success, if this thing were to be used, the real success is to align with regulatory agencies, to work with the development of regulation and governance to make it effective, hopefully streamlined and cleaner than what's evolved over the past couple of 100 years. I think we could all admit it's a rather bulky contrivance that manages the financial world right now. Bitcoin has the advantage of standing outside that yet while all those decisions are being considered and being made. And if the community involves itself in that process, aligns itself with the process, and understands that regulation in many instances is a very good thing,
Chris,
then
what did you
Bitcoin can benefit from
What did you say come in? In the beginning, Chris and I met each other a couple years ago, right? And he headed up the local Bitcoin chapter in Fort Lauderdale, and we met each other. And I'm the legacy payment guy coming into this group of programmers, and Chris coming in said something about what did you say about a regulatory then and now?
Yeah, when I first started with Bitcoin, I wasn't in this to discover new ways to regulate the market. And I quite quickly, maybe not quite quickly, but I've come to realize, albeit reluctantly, that regulations really work. They are an economic efficiency. I've seen enough 16-year-olds explode their banks at this point to know that there's a reason we have a lot of these rules in place. Mt. Gox being the most famous of them, there's others. And yes, quite literally 16-year-olds. They were running accidental Ponzi schemes and such. And it's because there's no framework. To your question, more specifically, though quickly, this is so new. We didn't even know Bitcoin was even legal, maybe, until a couple of years ago. And yeah, the regulators are catching up. A lot of businesses in South Florida are withheld from investing more into this currency because of the regulations that are holding them up. There is a lot of efficiency right now in the regulations and incumbent infrastructures, and that's why we see consumers that are really not switching to Bitcoin anytime soon. As that changes, then we'll see Bitcoin fall into place. I wouldn't say that Bitcoin is ready today. There's so much work that needs to be done, and recognizing that, and that's true. And it may not even work. This is really exciting. It's definitely neat. And it's very cool. But it's all contingent upon that type of work. It's very legitimate skepticism that I as well share.
One thing I follow Bitcoin very closely. One thing what I personally look at, learn lesson from fiat is simplicity. Bitcoin can learn the simplicity from fiat, it can go a long way.
Exactly. The thinking and the rationale, the philosophies around Bitcoin necessarily need to evolve in conjunction and cooperation with the environment they're going to really live in. You will, I personally don't believe you can achieve the kind of ubiquitousness that Bitcoin aficionados would like to see, completely independent, in a sort of anti-stance to regulation and governance. I think it needs to be a cooperative effort. Otherwise, make no mistake, sovereign governments will independently regulate all of it. And if the Bitcoin community is not participating, I doubt they're going to like the outcomes. So I think it's best to align together and work towards really effective management. Yes, sir.
So in the end, then, what's the legitimate purpose of having Bitcoin if you're going to regulate it? Because you've already got plenty of illegal tender out there, right?
Well, because there
Bitcoin created.
There are other, I would say the answer is that there are, and I'm sure everyone here has variations of their own answer, but part of the reason is being a distributed currency without central authority control, you eliminate some of the maybe downsides of fiat currency. I'm thinking specifically of the ability to create and destroy minted money and affect the value of currency outside of the market's influence on it.
I talk actually to you about that in my section towards the end, so I would probably defer to that. Though I will say that while I do believe regulation is necessary, I believe too that, and this is a little bit perhaps separate than your point, but there is a degree of regulation that is achievable with Bitcoin, and I don't think it's the same degree that we have currently, and it may be that the spread between what we have currently, if it is an efficiency economically, can be closed by other businesses. And you see this a lot in the Bitcoin world. Many businesses are performing some form of regulatory arbitrage currently, and that is their value add. And I'll talk about that a little bit. So there's a question of degree.
So, okay, so then eventually you're going to have to regulate it to a certain degree. Then, but other cryptocurrencies that are coming in before, are they going to be regulated as well?
Well, nobody knows. Thus far, it has been a non-concern. The alternate cryptocurrencies that have arrived have been so unspectacular as to not warrant much mention.
And many of them are actually centralized, which actually devalues some of the value of the way that Bitcoin is established.
And what little regulation I have seen or read doesn't speak to Bitcoin specifically, but rather to cryptocurrency or alternative currencies in a larger sense. So whether Bitcoin itself succeeds or something else comes to replace it or runs in parallel successfully with it, what little I have seen developed is really intended to cover the whole concept of digital cryptocurrency rather than just Bitcoin.
Creating like a free market currency.
Kind of.
Mm-hmm.
And to your point, that's really what that first bullet's all about. FinCEN said, oh, we have this thing, let's
Start to define it.
Let's define it so that anything like it falls under
Precisely.
it. And that's where we go.
Precisely.
So they called it virtual currency.
For a reason.
They called it googly good. It wouldn't matter what they called it. The regs would apply to that.
Exactly my point. The wording was not Bitcoin, the wording was virtual currency. So clearly other very intelligent people are looking at the possibility of a growing field of competing complementary currencies that could evolve in the digital space. And again, it's incumbent upon the cryptocurrency community, I think, to work cooperatively towards developing those regulations so that they enhance the safety of the consumer without inhibiting the value of the business itself, you know, without taking away the benefits that a cryptocurrency can represent.
You know, FinCEN, much like the IRS, just issued clarifications. So you're transferring value across here, and so they're just supporting the laws already on the books around money laundering and terrorist financing, things like that. The IRS classified Bitcoin actually much like a security where you would pay capital gains tax on the value change. That's just a clarification. If you look at more consumer-facing regulations like the CFPB or other places, they would actually, those are the places where a regulation is tied to a particular payment instrument. And in those cases, they have to go through the full motions of creating a regulation, which is a bit more onerous. And I think until a currency like this becomes like the sole way or an advantaged way or some reason why you would choose to use it, I think they'll stay out of that regulatory space. I'm just guessing. Because right now, it's all choice, right? You would only choose
Yeah,
to use it.
I think they really want to define it as something they already know there are regs in existence and apply versus coming up with a whole new set of regs if necessary.
Yeah.
They prefer
There's-
not to.
I'd argued almost as a human nature thing.
Yeah.
Because if you think about it, even like I've done earlier in this talk, the way by humans as we learn, we look at things and how we try to relate it to something we know to make sense of it. So when you don't understand it and it's extremely abstract, it's difficult to grasp it. So from a regulatory standpoint, they have to relate it to something that's there.
We'll actually go through a slide here in Travis's section that will visually sort of demonstrate an attempt to do exactly that. Existing regulation and how might it or does it apply to a cryptocurrency. So we'll revisit that very subject. We'll continue on with some of these myths and misunderstanding. Bitcoins are given away for free. We've talked about that to some extent. I think we don't need to really go into it. We understand that that's simply not the case. There is a significant investment in time, effort, and resources. The strict daily limits, the max caps, and the fact that not all mining efforts, which I don't know if I've fully elaborated on, but it was touched on, not all mining efforts necessarily result in you getting awarded with Bitcoin. If you're not the first validated, your efforts go unrewarded. So that's why, as Chris pointed out, there can be a very narrow margin because you can do a lot of work and not actually turn it into a reward unless you are the first approved and validated, because there's simultaneous work on the same set of problems. All right? So, no, it's not free. It's earned one way or another. Bitcoin is a Ponzi scheme. Well, what is a Ponzi scheme? Investments that come later are used to pay off earlier investors. Requires a central authority to manage this process. And of course, Bitcoin has none of those characteristics, so it simply is not. It can be used in a Ponzi scheme and has been. In fact, there'll be a slide that quotes a couple of cases in which the government has prosecuted individuals or entities for that, but that's independent of the currency. You can run a Ponzi scheme with dollars, you can run it with little gold nuggets, you can do it with Cheerios, whatever the case may be. Ultimately, the scheme itself is what's illegal. The transaction mechanism in the process is not fundamentally attached to that. So Bitcoin carries no further burden.
Just a moment. I want to answer your question, but again, Chris had mentioned something, and he actually said this earlier. He said, accidentally doing something illegally. 16-year-olds that accidentally do things illegally, right? So, and when he first said that to me once, I kind of laughed a little bit. It's like, so does that mean ignorance is bliss? I said, no, when it comes to the law, it's not. No, you need to kind of know what you're doing. And some of that is an attitude, a culture, and, there's some of that is a younger generation approach to things. I'm gonna do it my way. I don't care what anybody says, kind of thing. And pardon me?
Not reading the fine print.
Yeah, and it's kind of like, I don't care about all that. I'm gonna do it the way I want to do it. And then, and my argument was kind of, that's all fine and well, but it's a lot easier the way we should be doing things is look at what's wrong and try to fix it. That's the way we approach things, because otherwise it's kind of hard to do it while you're in jail. And so, Ponzi schemes and things like that, and we talked about Mt. Gox a little bit, because that kid was, literally, he was a millionaire at 16, just spent $11,000 for a round bed. He was a kid. So you give a kid multi-million dollars, he did, silly stuff, and he did whatever he wanted to do. And so as a result, he was just a guy who was trading Dungeons and Dragons cards originally and find a way to exchange that value. But one of the things that was funny during our conversation is that we've all been here, where you get caught up in what you're doing and you're so focused on keeping everything going and the ball's in the air. You do things and then you look back and go, oh, that was not really a smart thing to do. And the difference is these are seriously legal offenses, and they were just ignorant to the law for the most part. Now, and I have a little bit personal view that doesn't mean that you're not, you shouldn't have not fault in that, right? Ignorance isn't bliss, and you should actually know, pay attention a little bit. But that's also because I have 20-year-old kids that don't listen to me either. But, so I just wanted to kind of touch on that Ponzi scheme a little bit, because that does come up a lot. And it's more about them borrowing here and buying here, and there was bots that created free market. Well, if you think about, what does the market maker do today? Market maker does a penny stock. What does he do? He runs up the stock. And then anybody that buys it just lost all their money. Well, isn't that a form of Ponzi scheming in a way? Right? So it's just legal. Right? So the difference is they're just a little more educated and better way of doing it than these guys are. Right? So, and that's one of the reasons why Tony's, if you look at some of the approach on this, is that there's a lot of similarities of what's in our market today. But what's nice about what's happened with Bitcoin and this whole cryptocurrency movement, if you will, and I love the choice of words that Chris has, because it's about, it's a community, and it's really about forcing the change that maybe we need to look at things differently. Maybe we need to, not think about, interchange being 3.5% of every single transaction that goes through, and maybe we need to look at it differently. DeWall is looking at no transaction fees, and everyone has their approach to it. Whatever it is, who cares? But the point is maybe it's time to change. And so, and of course, we just need to somehow make sure it's within the legal realm, right? So, go ahead. So. Oh, well, I think we've been doing that a lot. So.
Yeah, actually, you're up, so just...
Okay, well, we'll do it from here. But so, oh yeah, sorry, go ahead.
So I recently got an advisory, I think, from CERT that said that businesses shouldn't bother to spend a lot of money upgrading their Cypher suites until the U.S. government comes out with something that is quantum computing resistant. So I'm curious if the cryptocurrency community has talked about whether that's a threat to miners and to the ability to validate the chain if quantum computing ever makes good on its theoretical promises.
Yeah.
Right, so quantum computing is still very theoretical. There's not an actual quantum computer, and there's a whole range of implementations that this machine could implement. And the nature of the problem is such that for any subset of those, there would be, yes, a systemic threat to the mining infrastructure, but not for all of them. And there are many proposals on the table to fix it. However, on the scheme of things that are probably going to impact Bitcoin, that isn't even remotely toward the top of the list, so there hasn't been much interest. It is very possible that at some point that the computation algorithm changes. There's no sense in doing that now because we don't actually really even have an example of what that threat is. That being said, I believe the NSA actually is they're sponsoring a lot of research in that area because this also affects a lot of U.S. infrastructure. And it is an interesting side bit. I believe the NSA is downgrading the security strength of SHA right now, SHA-256, and not because there's a fault in the algorithm, but because there's so much of an industry around mining that the reduction in strength is now apparent because of the economic incentives of Bitcoin, which is kind of interesting to like.
But you said you had a notification not to renew your digital cert?
No. Not to spend a lot of money, for example, going from SHA-1 to SHA-256.
Oh, okay.
Because the concern is that you may have just spent all of your money only to have that event horizon for quantum computing where suddenly, overnight...
So I'm curious about where it came from, because that sounds like a marketing type of email to me.
It was a government agency. I think it was CERT.
Are you sure it was quantum computing? Because there's two notices that I saw. One about quantum computing, one about downgrading from SHA-256, yeah.
I may have misread it. It was some time ago. But
You're a dev of some kind?
Sorry?
Are you a developer of some kind?
Security architect.
Okay.
I also, and I may be off base here because I'm just winging this, but I wonder about the significance of that concern against a technology that has not actually manifested.
Well, the challenge is you kind of have to figure out, I'll call it the event horizon, right? If somebody finally cracks quantum computing and then shortly thereafter builds a quantum computer, if a business has to take 18 months in order to upgrade everything, then if within a year they've got a quantum computer that can crack everything, then you're already, you're 6 months behind.
I would have two thoughts on that. One is, One is, where is that corner from a business efficiency, cost benefit standpoint? If it's a year or 18 months down the road, that's one thing. Quantum computing may not prototype for another 10 years or 20 years before it actually hits the open market. Who knows? So it's a valid argument, but I wonder about its context. And the second point is, when, and I believe it's inevitable, when quantum computing arrives in a substantive way, there's a whole lot more to consider than Bitcoin.
The movie Sneakers was kind of about that phenomenon too. If you remember that from like the 90s.
Was that?
You ever see the movie Sneakers? It's a great movie, Sneakers.
Oh,
It's
no, I
basically
don't.
about this. Right, in context, Bitcoin is probably for the foreseeable future the smallest part of the ramifications of that ideology, right? So, I mean, think about it.
And I appreciate your position because you have to be thinking ahead all the time, right? But I would also think about it, even from a governmental notice standpoint, you can't think myopically and think that that's going to be one solution.
I'm not trying to poke holes in Bitcoin at all.
No, I'm actually.
Oh, it's an excellent
This is an open discussion, right? No, this is more an open discussion. The point is I'm actually thinking of it as, whenever you look at one item and saying, well, this is going to come along in the future and knock that out, but there's other ways to mitigate risks. I see it as a risk mitigation type of discussion, right? Because you're thinking, okay, I need to do this or I need to do this to protect myself against this. From a security standpoint, you're always thinking ahead. What's the next biggest threat, right? And how do I block that threat, right? Because you're in a defensive mode. And you have to react, right? So I can appreciate that viewpoint. And so I would simply say it's not always one ways to defend yourself. Right? And it's just the whole concept of honeypotting versus other, there's a lot of different ways of doing things from a security standpoint, leading people this way or that way. And as the old football analogy is, the best defense is an offense, right? And I think that in security, we're going to start seeing that more and more. The more offensive we become in a security perspective, instead of defense. Because if you're in a defense, you're always behind the 8 ball. You're always waiting for that break, that hack, that one thing goes, I didn't think of that, right? But that's why I use honeypotting as an example, because now you're like making them chase you. It's like, to me, security a lot is about a mentality of how you approach things, right?
Quantum computing might present its own solutions, it just occurred to me.
So I didn't want to take it out of Bitcoin only, right? It's more of an abstract type of question, right? Yeah.
Right. The thought I started to have as Travis spoke was with looking at it from one direction, the incredible power of quantum computing to break down existing security just through sheer brute horsepower could in fact turn around and also create mechanisms that go on the attack, that advance the security in advance of the attack. Right? Quantum computing is such a fundamental change to all of it in speed and power and capacity that it's almost an unpredictable thing at this point how it would be applied. So I would think in the short term, perhaps it's not an immediate concern. Let's move on to...
Good question over here.
Yeah.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Is there another question?
I was just going to say, also take into consideration who sent you the notice, which agency it might have been from, because some of them are better at others at understanding these kinds of complex issues.
Agreed. And I would think that most, and I'll say this at the risk of offending anybody possibly in the room, but working with the federal agencies personally during the economic crisis with the FDIC, the Fed, and OCFI and CFPB, they tend to be more reactive also, and they're still trying to understand exactly what they're supposed to be regulating. Sometimes, let's face it, the rules aren't always very clear, and they're very abstract because they're written by legislators, right? So they're written by attorneys that are trying to box things in a little bit, and then somebody has to execute on that. Right, so I was in meetings when the FDIC and OCFI were arguing with the Fed on whose responsibility it was to execute parts of the Dodd-Frank, and it was classic. So to your point, I think you got to look at who sent it, where their level of expertise is, and that's why I was asking if it was a marketing type of thing. It sounded like it was almost like, here, buy this, because we got a better solution for you or something, so, okay.
Would you like to pick up the conversation about regulation and governance?
Yeah, and I'm gonna, I don't want to belabor on this too much from a negative standpoint, because, I think we've integrated a lot of this talk already with a lot of different topics, and one of the things I want to make sure we get to also is I want Overstock and Judd to have a chance to talk about the benefits and from a retail perspective what it means too. So we talk about a lot of the fundamentals and the background and what it is and how it works. And from a regulatory standpoint, I think one of the things to look at is that there are a number of bodies that are regulatory environment or regulatory, could be regulatory agencies that you need to comply or align with because it depends on what you're doing, right? And one of the key things to understand, and this is the same in payments or Bitcoin or any kind of money movement, depending on what you're doing and how you're positioned and what kind of stakeholder you're going to be in that value chain depends on what kind of regulatory alignment you need to have and you need to pay attention to. So there's a number of ones that people hear about. Somebody said earlier the CFPB. That's the that was Rob, I think. That's the consumer-facing side. They're the consumer watchdogs, if you will, that protect the consumer. And sometimes they're a little misguided. Operation Chokehold, I think, was a little misguided, but they were trying to approach something. For those that don't know what that's about, CFPB went after the short-term lending market, or actually payday lending market a couple months ago. And instead of actually saying that it's legal or it's wrong, they just went to the people that processes and the processors and banks and said, we'll audit you until you make your eyes bleed if you continue to do this business. So obviously, overnight, they just cut it off. Banks are not really audit friendly. They don't really want you there as an auditor. So, and a processor, they see, I got revenue, you're making me risk my revenue, and then fine, I'll stop. And it's that simple. It was probably taking something that was not really illegal, but making people feel that it was illegal. And now, in the end, if it's something that's wrong, it needs to be executed correctly and going through a process of change and rulemaking change like our system is set up to do. But CFPB is ultimately the body that protects the consumer. This FinCEN is I call them they're the hardcore group of the government that will, the SWAT team, if you will, the financial services industry. You do not want to get a visit from them. This group is really when you're doing something illegal. But to the point we were making earlier with Chris is that sometimes in this world of change, not everybody realizes how much they're infringing on that. And I'm going to talk about just in a minute after I go through these is kind of a differentiator that'll help you understand where that lies. IRS, for obvious reasons, everybody has their interest, if you will. The FinCEN's more about terrorist money, anti-money laundering, illegally exchanging funds from one to the other, which is money transmitter and agency rules. IRS is about taxation, obviously, and making sure the government gets their cut of living in this great country and paying your dues. And then the SEC is more the capital market side. So now you're talking about buying and selling, exchanging, just like a stock market. Now, if you think about the different things I mentioned earlier, when we talk about different groups, right? We talked about libertarian, a little viewpoint, a little engineering or energy green. We talk about payment side of things. There's a lot of different viewpoints here that are involved. So I'll go back to the other one before a minute. So the SEC, the reason why that's a component is because we're talking about buying and selling. You see capital markets starting to look at the blockchain for the purposes of validating trades, stock trades. And let's face it, they've been trading Bitcoin values just like a currency. I mean, there's day traders that trade currencies all day long. I got friends that do that. They can make a good living at $70,000, $80,000, $100,000 a year just trading European euros with dollars and overnight, right? So Bitcoin, they've been doing that from the very beginning and trading, and in essence, that's an FX exchange, right? So that's why the SEC can get involved. So the key is that it can be, depending on how you're using it, it can be a payment mechanism, it can be an asset, it can be, you know, if you're an asset, then you're selling it, and then it's IRS rules. If it's a payment function, then it could be FinCEN, or it could be CFPB if you're interfacing with a customer. You know, there's a lot of different aspects of it. If the bottom line is you're getting in the financial services world. If you're going to be a bank, you're going to be regulated. If you're going to be a payment processor, you're going to be regulated. You have to follow those particular rules. Now, the key thing with Bitcoin and any cryptocurrency is it's about the exchange of funds and that value exchange that I mentioned earlier. So in the world of the payments arena today, we have a lot of stakeholders. We have people that actually touch the money, and we have the people that that process, that are the IT side of things. You know, so in the ACH world, they call it an originator, which is the person that sends it, right? And then you have the destination, which is where it's going, right? And in between, you got a couple different entities there. You got banks that have to actually move the money, which is, again, an ACH called ODFI. You know, sometimes they're just called FIs, or for financial institutions. But they're the ones with the accounts where things move. And then you have the IT side, which is the processors. You know, your First Datas, your FISs. Sometimes it's a network like a Visa and a MasterCard. You know, it's the people that actually facilitate that move and keep with it's really a digital transaction of that money, just like the blockchain is today, if you will, on the Bitcoin side. The key thing is that holding of money. Because if you take receipt of those funds into your account as an entity, then you have a lot more regulatory rules that you have to comply to. If you take receipt of funds over state lines, you are a money transmitter, period. You have to have licenses in every state that you transmit. Now, is that antiquated? Yeah. This was back in the days of Wells Fargo, not the bank, but rather the stagecoach, when they were taking funds from one state to the next, and then they had to exchange it from one entity to the next, right? And that means they had to have a license to carry it from here to here. Those are still in the books, hence my comment about, you know, 5 years, and to the gentleman in the room, it's more like, you know, 100 years, 50 years old, you know, as far as the rules are concerned. Do they need to catch up? Yes, and there's a lot of us in the industry believe that should be one big national license, and still you have to be registered with FinCEN because you are moving money there. But anytime you're in those categories or taking the receipt of that funds, then you have a trust factor, if you will, in the industry that you feel that you have to be trusted. And so regulatory bodies, governments alike, want to make sure that you are doing the right thing for the people because you have a trusted source of touching those funds. So in essence, you're an extension of a bank. If you don't ever take receipts of those funds, then you're more of a processor. In the ACH world, they call it a third-party processor or a third-party sender, and payment processing is just payment processor, or an ISO is called like a sales organization where you're just selling the account. You're not even touch it, right? So there's these different stakeholders that live in the payments world today that really don't exist in Bitcoin. And this is where some of the rub comes in, because I'm like, wait a minute, I have a wallet and I'm sending it to you, then I'm the sender and you're the receiver, so what's the problem, right? Why can't I do that? Seems simple enough, right? But in essence, if I live in Florida and he lives in New York, I just broke a rule. Because I sent money from my account to his account and we both touched the money. So who's the facilitator? A blockchain that doesn't exist. Now you see where this ambiguity can come into place, right? So the thing is you want to make sure you comply with some of these rules. Are they not necessarily up to date? No, they're not. But the way to do it is get involved, and there are a number of groups. There's a group, not to promote in any way, but Brian Caves is an attorney group that's very strong in the prepaid market that is also in money transmitters. And they have started, and they're part of an organization on Capitol Hill to help evolve some of these changes. And if you want to get involved, please let me know. A bunch of us are working to help bring clarity to understanding to some of these nuances and how do we clarify some of those rulings. And working with the regulatory bodies and helping them understand it too, and how we can find a happy medium, whether it be, so it might be a license. It's just to make sure that you identify, hey, Travis does this. And, in the age-old world of audits and regulatory environment, if you guys remember what a SAS 70 is, SAS 70 said that you had to write out a policy. It says, well, I do it this way. I move water like this to that. And I wrote a policy and I put it on a piece of paper. So as long as my auditor came and says, you know what, Travis moves the water from here to there. Okay, you passed. That was a SAS 7. Well, an SSA 16 now, which is more, again, a technical audit, says that not only did I move my water there, but you know what, I have to prove it. So now I got to get Judd over here to tell me, yep, at 10:45 a.m. I picked it up, and at 10:47 p.m. I put it down. And he put the log in, and the log's in the date and time. And the auditor sees his log, and it was there, and I prove it, then I did it, then I've passed. So if you think like an auditor, and if you think about what they want, and that's what I mean by clarity, is say, look, if you say you're going to do something, then do it, and prove that you did it. Well, in technology today, it allows us to do that very easily. And it's just about kind of reverse engineering. I mean, some of you might have heard QA designing or designing by looking at what you're going to build and reverse engineering it, and that's the way you build something so that you pass QA. Well, in a way, that's what it amounts to, is just looking at a use case, looking at how people use things and being more user-friendly. That's the way things should be designed from a design perspective. And a lot of times when you get something, if you ever picked up a product or used something on the computer or on the internet that it just feels weird, it's like, where's the button? And you're looking for it. And everybody's looking for your okay or your approval down in the bottom right-hand corner, right? Because we've been trained that way. And then somebody all of a sudden puts it up in the left, and you're looking, and you'll stare at that screen for 5 minutes and you will not see it, even though it's standing right in your face. It's because we're trained a certain way. So all I'm trying to say is, from a regulatory standpoint, is if we understand what we need to comply with, and then we provide that type of information to the auditors, to our regulatory bodies, then we shouldn't have a lot of problem. But we do have to, in fact, change into things that are older. And there's a number of different things you can get in trouble with, if you will. And this is kind of a list of some of them. A SARS is the MSB ruling or a notice. If you get served one of these, basically they think you've done something wrong, whether you have or not. But it's where you've broken a rule from a money transfer standpoint. AML, I think everyone here probably knows what AML is, anti-money laundering. The funny story is Visa and MasterCard never even paid attention to that for the longest time. So they made money on it, so nobody really paid attention to it. So the longest time you had all kinds of money laundering activity happening, and when it became popular to track this, it became an issue. I grew up in the age of prepaid some 20 some odd years ago, and it was comical because we were like, bleeding edge, because we were tracking money and where money moved from one place to the next, because we would have money deposited in a prepaid card in Latin America and all of a sudden pulled out 5 seconds later in Japan. That's not mysterious. It's just, you had to kind of track those and keep up with that. And that's the same time that OFAC came along, which is another part of anti-terrorist aspects. So there's
You don't have any money laundering in South Florida, do you?
No, no. That's one of the things about, I think somebody put a banner up that said, in South Florida, if you want to be, a crook, you might as well be warm and enjoy it, right? And it's between that and the homeless, I think we have the one. Yes, sir.
So you mentioned suspicious activity reports and currency transaction reports. Now, who's doing those for virtual currency?
Who's doing, and what do you mean by who's doing it? You mean from an entity standpoint? Well, but see, that's what I was talking about from a product perspective earlier. It's up to the entity to take that responsibility. There are
peer-to-peer, then how?
In a peer-to-peer, you have that lack of that. So, you know, you have a function that you can carry things out like that. Nobody's reporting that type of activity. It's on the blockchain. It can be identified from a transactional if you're scanning that, and that's some of the opportunity I think that Chris was talking about. There's businesses popping up to provide that, we'll call it regulatory compliance and or clarity to a lot of different things. Look at Ideology, right? Ideology is a simple company that validates who you are or who you are. When you submit a transaction, I can submit a transaction for a couple pennies and say, yep, that's you. That's who you are, who you say you are, right? So those are little boutique companies that are popping up all over the place. And there's a lot of small companies in the Bitcoin world that are trying to do KYC type activities, that are trying to validate the source of destination. Chris mentioned a couple earlier, you know, and then it's just no different than encryption or authentication. That's a whole market in itself. Look at the voice recognition aspect of it. Now that hasn't really caught on yet, but you know, it's the technology's there. It's ready. Think about today. You can go into Google and you can just speak, and it'll you know, everything you got, or it's your phone for that matter, your Android or your iPhone, you know, you can talk into it now. So look how good that's got down, and the voice text type of recognition. So that is being used in a authentication standpoint, and that's just one example, right? And it takes time for adoption and acceptance, because what happens is in any evolution of any business, somebody's opening a business to do what? You're not there for nonprofit. You're there to make money, right? And in the end, the person that's making money, somebody's going to be willing to pay for it. As I used to say, the dogs have to eat the food. It might be a great idea, but it's all about that commerce. The biggest thing with cryptocurrency and Bitcoin today, there's not quite enough money moving around right now. There's a lot of VC money flowing in, right? But from a commerce perspective, it's still weak. You know, it's moving around, and there's no what's the old business side? What's the first thing you learn in business school? Supply and demand, right? So if the money pulls out of Bitcoin, and that's, you know, Chris talks about every 10 minutes it's validated, right? And when we had the sell-off, why do you think everybody was worried about the sell-off Silk Road Bitcoins? Because then it drops the circulation, right? Mt. Gox was the same thing, and it actually did happen a little bit with Mt. Gox. I don't know if that was the reason, but you know, sometimes it's also public reaction, because when it's an open network that is all user-based, it's like a political situation, because it's all based on public reaction. If you look at a stock market, our stock market adjusts the same way, right? So to answer your question, who's just doing that peer-to-peer? It depends on the wallet.
It's on the dark web, so they're obviously not.
Let me add to that. So Ideology is being used by almost all the ATM vendors in the United States, from what I've seen, and SARs are being issued by them and by Coinbase, which is a de facto bank as well. So what you typically see are that these enforcement efforts are at the interchange points, in and out of the network. Once in the network, nobody's doing anything, in part because the ability is not there yet, in part because it may not ever be there. That remains to be seen.
A lot of that is also.
And it's not clear you need to.
It's not clear you don't need to.
A lot of that is that community thing that, you know, Chris refers to it, and don't forget that what started it still exists, which is a group that really doesn't want to be regulated, right? So, and there's always going to be that, but what we're trying to advocate to some extent is how the we can take it and commercialize it and move it into something that makes it more beneficial and have a higher value proposition from a commercial standpoint. But there will always be users of the darknet. There will, you know, it's just like there will always be crooks. And to Tony's point earlier, that, you know, just from our conversation, I'm assuming that, you know, your job is to find those guys, right? And so the whole idea is that there's always going to be, today, think about the hackers in the very beginning. The very beginning hackers that broke into things, what did they become? Security guys, right? So what I'm trying to say is because they knew more than anybody else, they become businesses in themselves. right? And some of the big security firms are full of just are hackers. You know, one of the top CTOs I've ever known is a pure hacker, and he can hack just about anything. But that also makes him a good security guy. He also can be a little step ahead. So, you know, I think that to Chris's earlier point is it's since we're still early, there's a lot of evolution there. And to my point is somebody got to be paid to do it in the end. So, you know, the best way to approach that sometimes, maybe you want to hire the guys that are kind of above your side, right, to give some of that insight.
In the interests of time and content here, we have a lot of good content. I'm gonna kind of drop the hammer a little bit and move us through this section and get on to the next. If everyone, you know, whoever's staying for the duration, there's going to be plenty of time. I think we can take up a lot of this regulatory and governance conversation independently and repeatedly. Let me just blow through a couple of these slides and so we can move along here. The point of this section really is just to briefly touch on the ways regulation and governance are evolving now, and in what ways existing regulation influences cryptocurrency and Bitcoin. In the last couple of slides, we've been talking about federal level. There are state level regulations that are already touching our conversation and touching cryptocurrencies, the requirements of money transmitter licenses and definitions thereof. There's some virtual currency specific regulation that just most notably came out of the New York Department of Financial Services, I think it's called, and they wrote specific bit license regulation for exchanges. There are requirements at state taxing taxing authority levels. State market regulators also have existing regulation, again, to Travis's point, that already by definition have to affect the use of cryptocurrency, but there are still mistakes made and a lot of education to be done on some of the players' parts. State transmitter regulations generally cover consumer protection and AML, capital and liquidity requirements, various forms of documentation and record keeping. I want to touch real briefly, just again, to mention some of the ways that federal and state regulators have already conducted enforcement actions. I touched on this earlier. The SEC versus Shavers was a case in which the defendant was accused of running a Ponzi scheme. There have been money laundering charges. That's what brought the two Silk Road cases. Unregistered offerings or exchanges. You can see the three cases there. BTC Trading, Voorhees and Burnside were all brought to court. Deceptive marketing charges even. So again, to some of these concerns, existing regulation already does govern the behaviors because those regulations are broad enough to cover cryptocurrencies within the existing financial network. Is Bitcoin legal? Well, it depends. Again, as we've been discussing, it depends on the definitions and what you're doing and how you're doing it and how you are therefore defined by the law. FinCEN defines a person that creates units of convertible virtual currency and uses it to purchase real or virtual goods and services is a user of the convertible virtual currency and not subject to regulation as a money transmitter.
Which would actually go to your point about the SARS. If it's a person-to-person, based on the guidance we're given today, it's not required. If you're a user.
Right.
If you're exchanging.
Something else to remember too is that we have seen online currencies before. You see this all the time online in video games. They're just centrally controlled. Certainly they're very different, but there are some precursor environments by which we have, I think, some reason to draw a regulatory conclusion.
Well, even Disney dollars are the virtual currency.
There are online in-game currencies which have legitimate, very specific, trackable connections to fiat currency, and they're entirely legal. I would by no means present myself as an expert and able to interpret, but at least anecdotally we can see that under the right conditions, if you're behaving properly, you are completely legal. but there are ways to step out of line and behave as Chris, I think, coined the, accidental criminals who are doing things that they don't realize in effect amount to criminal activity. Again, as to legality, FinCEN spoke to miners as opposed to users. By contrast, a person that creates units of convertible virtual currency and sells those units to another person for real currency or fiat currency or its equivalent is engaged in money transmission to another location and is therefore a money transmitter. So it's all about understanding what currently exists and how it's going to apply to you individually, your business, or your actions. In summary, yes, it's perfectly legal to mine Bitcoin, but if you mine them and sell them as opposed to make purchases with them, you change your legal definition, at least according to FinCEN, as to whether or not you're a money transmitter and therefore whether or not what you're doing is legal. So this is all within the context of what currently exists. Exchanges. In addition, a person's an exchanger and a money transmitter if the person accepts these convertible virtual currencies from one person and transmits it to another as part of the acceptance and transfer of currency, funds, or other value as substitutes. Again, in the interest of time, I'm going to move along here, but we can see, again, it's just really making the same case that current regulation already affects.
And by the way, this presentation will be available online. We'll make sure everybody, all the attendees will have access to a link so you can review it at your own speed too. You had a question?
Just that one slide back, on the bottom, providing they comply with applicable laws and regulations, according to who?
Well, in
Your country, the country where you're at, country and/or state or province, depending on the country.
and sometimes bank, because in the end, you have to move money to a financial organization, right? Because if you stayed Bitcoin the whole time, it would be one answer. If you convert it to fiat, then there's another answer, right? So the bottom line is you need guidance, right? And one of the things I do want to make sure we go on record to say is you always want to confide with your legal advisors, right, when it comes to this. It is always changing. It's not always something you have to take direct. Legal advice is just that, advice, right? But then when you take that advice, it's based on the risk that you're willing to take, from that, right? Because they tend to be more conservative. But typically, what will happen is your bank will give you a direction that they want you to be in. It might not be what you want to hear, but if there's very few banks that are willing to take the risk today between a number of reasons. Brand risk. It's not always fiduciary risk. Sometimes it's just brand risk. A good example is we mentioned the Operation Choke Point, right? There's banks today. Matter of fact, I don't know a bank today that will take a payday lender because most of their boards go, nah, we just don't want to deal with it, right? And title loans are about the same thing. That's where they give you a title to your car and you loan against it, right? And then they take your car, you can get to work, and kind of kills the whole idea. But so your bank really drives some of this, and so they are the ones that end up giving you that guidance. You got your personal legal guidance, and then your bank and where you're at. Now again, it depends on what country you're in, but if in the United States, your bank's going to drive a lot of that. And sometimes, and there's another entity in the payments where we have a stakeholder, what we call a program manager. Which in that world, they kind of give you guidance and help you navigate through that. Typically what will happen is they have a relationship with a bank and they've got a trust with the bank and they build a due diligence clarity with audit and so forth that helps facilitate that. So in the prepaid world, that was something that was real, that used this term program manager. And they're the ones that are responsible, fiduciary typically, to move the money. And they're the ones that will end up taking that risk of that. So it depends on where you're at within the value chain and what you're playing, what kind of stock or stakeholder you're playing. Right.
Some of the biggest concerns that are discussed right now, money laundering is a very valid concern, and certainly one of the first places that it makes obvious sense to protect consumers by applying existing or modified or new anti-money laundering standards and regulations. Another concern is the decentralized nature of cryptocurrency, being entirely outside governing agencies' experience, and without there's one case where the contrast is interesting. Without a centralized governing entity, it's more difficult to envision how oversight would be effectively enacted. Doesn't mean it can't be done. There's a whole lot of smart people in the world who keep coming up with really good ideas. So I certainly don't think that it's a complete roadblock, a non-starter, but it is a concern that that we think is a valid one. It's therefore more difficult to monitor. And as I said, outside of prior experience means that people have to really stop and reconsider how to effect the proper protections and do so effectively. One of the questions of the session, why do I care? Well, partly you care because it's here. So it's time to get used to the idea and to figure for yourselves, for your businesses, how cryptocurrency may or may not make sense to you and your business. There's access to potential new customers. There are adopters. There are growing numbers of them, and they'd like to be able to use it. That can be useful in getting feet through the threshold and into your store or transacting with your business online. It challenges the nature of money itself, which is an ongoing debate. What is money? And it opens up a whole lot of new and very interesting questions, the answers to which, or the debate of those questions, can open new ideas into what we've taken to be a sort of static environment. Challenges the nature of banking and payments. I just read, I think it was 2 weeks ago, that 8 of the world's biggest banks are quietly but actively looking at the blockchain, the distributed network model of Bitcoin, for its potential advantages as a replacement for the current closed hub and spoke proprietary database nature of modern banking. And we talked about that just briefly earlier. An alternative way to conduct business. And of course, even if Bitcoin itself fails, understanding these questions in the grander space of cryptocurrency, it's the toothpaste and the tube, it's the genie in the bottle. It's not going back. The questions are out there, so it behooves us all to understand them and participate in the debate. Let's move on. I'm just watching the time and getting concerned. Let's move on to Mr. Bagley of Overstock.com. And I'll turn over to you. Okay, let's do this without my breaking a leg.
Okay. So in January of 2014, Overstock began accepting Bitcoin as a method of payment, and this is interesting because it's kind of part of a larger sort of a philosophical approach that our company takes to everything. We have a very unique CEO in Patrick Byrne. This fellow is a PhD, got his master's degree in cryptography, essentially, and has a very kind of healthy distrust of centralized institutions, especially when it comes to finance, et cetera, et cetera. So all these things kind of put us, kind of combine to make us probably a logical first mover in this space. So I just want to give a little bit of a sense of context here, and we're going to talk for a second about exciting moments in bookkeeping history. This is compelling, I promise. So you start in the year 3000 BC with the Sumerians, and these guys would they created these clay tablets, and they created this cuneiform form of writing, and then they would take and they would fire the tablets, so they became hard and they became impossible to change. The record became immutable, in other words. And they did so much of this. I was speaking to someone who has who's involved in kind of classics, and she said that they found at least 1.5 million of these things. So many they don't even bother to translate them anymore because they're so complex. But it's interesting that this record-keeping method that was created to be immutable has proven to be extremely immutable, and it was so successful that this form of bookkeeping is credited with having created government and standardized writing, which are two kind of big, that's a lot of what it means to be human, and that came out of this form of bookkeeping. Then we flash forward to about the year 1387 in the Medici Bank of Florence. They came up with dual entry bookkeeping. And that, of course, led to quite a bit of trust, because this was one way of being able to trace the provenance of all funds coming in and out. That was important. So people trusted the Medici Bank with their earnings. The Medici family, therefore, became quite wealthy. They commissioned all kinds of artwork, and that led to wealth and the Renaissance. Also, you know, two biggish kind of things in human history. Then we move forward to the year 2008, and Satoshi Nakamoto, who I think is still probably anonymous, he introduces the new this idea of a peer-to-peer electronic cash system. And through that we have the blockchain, which we believe is the third great innovation in bookkeeping and will in the end have an effect equally as profound as that came out of Sumeria and that came out of Florence. The issue is trust. So if you go back to how things were done in antiquity, if I'm going to trade something, it would necessarily have to be with someone in my immediate vicinity, and you wouldn't trade with me unless you knew you could trust me that I would deliver on the thing that I said I was going to deliver on. That was true peer-to-peer exchange. As time has gone by, and trade has happened over much longer distances, it's impossible to have that kind of trust with someone that you cannot see. And so consequently, we've come up with these centralized institutions that step in the middle, and they act as a proxy for trust. So in the case of Visa, like I may not, if I want to trade with you, I don't know you and you don't know me, I don't trust you, but we both trust Visa, so we trust Visa to carry out that transaction in the middle, but Visa takes its cut. So it adds friction. It costs money and time frequently. Now, something that's really interesting to note is that in once a year at Overstock.com, we have all our suppliers get together, and we have a big kind of a conference with them. And when everyone's kind of milling about, you can't really tell by looking at somebody what exactly it is they sell, with one exception. There's a group of Orthodox Jews that are there. They and you can know with certainty that what they sell and what they provide to our site are diamonds. And so you wonder what is it about Orthodox Judaism that they are our provider of diamonds. That's just the way it goes. And there's some historical, political reasons that play into that. But a large part of it is that these guys, there is a portion of the whole mechanic of trading diamonds that requires one person to be in possession of diamonds before they've actually paid for them. And they hold on to those for days at a time. And there's a real solid opportunity to take those things out that you've yet to pay for, and you could commit fraud. But that doesn't happen because these folks belong to the same groups, but the same religion. And so there's an amount of trust that's already built in. And because that trust exists, this is an interesting hybrid between the old peer-to-peer trading system and the newer, more friction-heavy systems. These guys this is in the middle of that. And because they don't have to rely on that trust, or rather, the trust is already built in. They don't have to invest all the time and effort in building it up. They are especially good in this marketplace of diamond trading. So what cryptocurrency sort of represents is a version of that. It's a way to conduct business on a peer-to-peer basis without having to rely on a central authority to get in the middle and cost money and time. So here's kind of an example of it. In the old days, let's say you had, one person wanted to buy a catcher's mitt from the other, and they would, that's kind of how it would go. They were neighbors. They would do it that way. Today, you can turn that money. You get this cryptographically protected ledger that's public and transparent. You can turn that money into coins, and instead, all you do is so they each have their set of coins. It's erased on one end and just immediately added to the ledger of the other. That's all it takes. So that's it. So we've discussed a lot of these things. I added this for context for what's about to follow. It may not have been completely necessary because we've gone over some of these things. But now let me tell you about the specifics of Overstock's experience 1 year after Bitcoin integration. We've brought in $3.2 million in Bitcoin revenue. between 50 and 80%. Initially, 80% of the Bitcoin purchasers were new customers. Now it's down to 50. Some weeks it's as low as 30% new customers. But of course, this is going to go down because, and we're glad to see it go down, because this means that people that were initially brought to the site because of our acceptance of Bitcoin they're returning, and they're, with subsequent purchases, are no longer new customers. The cost has been remarkably small. We use a company called Coinbase to carry out is our payment processor, and it is, the cost of working with them is so, I can't reveal how low it is, but let's just say it's low enough to be not even worth mentioning. And as a low-cost retailer, our margins are about 3% on transactions. Now, when credit card companies want to charge 3% to do their thing, you can immediately see the tremendous impact that accepting Bitcoin has on our bottom line. Also, the cost to initially accept Bitcoin was also very small. Coinbase has an API. You don't necessarily have to know what that means, other than the fact that it makes it extremely easy for somebody on the outside to collect information and add it almost seamlessly into your own database. So the exchange of information is very easy. So the cost was minimal, and the savings, as I mentioned, have been great, and we consider it, a tremendous success. So here's something that's very interesting. After about a year and a half, I've gone back and I've done an analysis of all the Bitcoin purchasing over the past 18 months. And then I've adjusted it for population. So obviously California comes out first, just on a pure gross basis. But then if you adjust by population, you get some really interesting trends pop up. The number one state for use of Bitcoin in the nation is New Hampshire, based on population, which makes a certain amount of sense because this is kind of our libertarian mecca of the United States. So New Hampshire is sort of that's kind of the number one holy site in the Bitcoin religion. Number two, this is very recently, is Washington, D.C. has just barely edged out Utah, which made me sad because we're based in Utah. So I had been very proud to see Utah being number two. We're going to get that back, and I'm going to make a point of it. And I think the Utah aspect is we have a real strong entrepreneurial culture, a lot of early adopters, and a very healthy sort of self-sufficiency ethic there, which I think there's this sort of constant sort of reminder of this idea that maybe someday we're going to have to do all the things we do without the government there to help us do it. And so people are most people have a year's food storage in their basements, and I know a lot of people will want to have a bit of income stored up in a way that they'll be able to continue to use if the zombie apocalypse happens. So number 4 is the state of Washington, then Vermont, another kind of libertarian place, Colorado, Massachusetts, Nevada, Oregon, and California. Now, as far as the other big states are concerned, New York comes in at 18th, Illinois, where we are, is 21st, then Florida at 24th, then Texas, and then bringing up the rear, so sadly, as with so many things, are South Dakota and Mississippi. So that's, we're trying to get Mississippi up above. Mississippi's got to be sick of being 50th and 51st in everything. We're hoping to see that get better. I'm going to tell you a little bit about what Bitcoin people shop for. Now, when we started this thing, I was under the assumption that it would be primarily geeky stuff. A lot of computer accessories, video cards. Video cards are what render graphics on your computer. Basically, what they do is math, and Bitcoin miners use video cards. That's how this stuff's done. So I thought there'd be a lot of video cards and things like that. It's not been like that at all. Number 1 is sheets. So I guess all humans, that's one thing. We all got to sleep. That's one thing we all have in common is sheets. Number 2, when you check out, when you buy something at Overstock and you check out, you're given the option of spending $1 on one of a few different nonprofits that we support, and we set that purchase aside as its own category. And number 2 are donations. So that's significantly higher than what it is for people that are shopping, that are using credit cards. So Bitcoin shoppers are generous. Then we have like phone cases and holders, mattresses, headphones, cables and tools, tables, men's fragrances, which makes sense for a statistic I'll show you in just a moment, fashion sunglasses, and vacuum cleaners. Yes?
How do those purchase decisions, how does that list compare to what we'll call your typical overstock shopping?
It's almost indistinguishable except for the donations part. So donations is quite a bit higher. Everything else, this is pretty much where we do our thing. We sell a lot of vacuum cleaners, a lot of housewares, sheets and towels are kind of one of the top things we sell just because we have outstanding deals on those things. So I encourage you to, no, we really do though. We're kind of known for that because we do an outstanding job sourcing those things. So with the exception of donations, which is quite a bit higher, everything else is just the same. Bitcoiners are mostly male, and you see they come in at about 24 to 35 years old. They're very loyal. They're much more likely to come back and shop with us. In retail, there's a truism which says that if you can get someone to shop with you, that the first time they come to your site, you've accomplished something. It's when they come back a second time, and ideally within 30 days, then they are extremely likely to become, then they're yours. Bitcoin shoppers are extremely likely to come back inside those 30 days. And what's really exciting about this is the fact that, it's difficult to distinguish and to separate Bitcoin from the Bitcoin community. And when a new major operation comes online and accepts Bitcoin, news of it travels like wildfire through the Bitcoin community, and these people are very zealous, and so they're eager to spread the word and get other people. They want to show their support. So this is something that we've experienced, and in a world where online retailers are overjoyed to pay $20 to $25 to acquire a customer, the cost of acquisition for a Bitcoin user is remarkably small. Bitcoin users also tend to spend more than average. Their average order size is about $200 versus $160 for a regular customer. Now, one thing to keep in mind is, go ahead.
How much of that do you attribute to you being an early adopter of this?
How much of the
cost profile and the loyalty component? I mean, there aren't that many places to spend Bitcoin, so if you got them.
Yeah, that's and plus we were early, so that has something to do with it, but not. If you look at the curve showing revenue per week over time, it's that typical power law. I mean, it was our first 24 hours we made $180,000 in it. That was the revenue, and which itself covered the cost of integration. We covered the cost of integration in hours, but it's kind of has an asymptotic relationship with about the $5,000 a day level. So $5,000 a day is about where it's settling in. So, so I think that's probably where it would be anyway. So that early spike is probably a result of where we were in the timeline. Since then, so $5,000 a day, that appears to be what we can always kind of count on. Now, something that's interesting is, for reasons I won't get into now, we couldn't immediately integrate over international purchases. It took about 5 months before international purchases could be made with Bitcoin. And we thought when we opened that up, it was going to explode because, the United States represents, 2.5–3% of the world's population. For reasons we don't understand, it has not worked out that way at all. International purchases with Bitcoin have been very small. However, the average order size tends to be very big, about $1,000, but you will only get a handful of those in any month. So,
well, I think that the majority, Chris, correct me if I'm wrong, but the majority of Bitcoin users, transactional spenders like that, are actually U.S. based, right?
Yeah, I'm pretty sure it's US and then Europe.
Yeah, in Europe. I mean, other countries are adopting for different reasons. Some of them are for assets, or holding assets. Argentina is coming on strong, but that's because of the economies. So when an economy is unstable, cryptocurrencies are being used as a refuge. necessarily. So they use it differently, right? So some of them use it for purchasing, some of them use it for asset, classification or storage, if you will. So it depends on how they're using it. And internationally, I don't know that the spend is, behavioral patterns are the same. And honestly, just from a spend and even a payments perspective, we're much more mature as a society and a economic framework than a lot of the other locations, other than Europe, which is still evolving right now, and they're coming along pretty quickly, actually.
Another thing we've noticed is if you chart Bitcoin price, and you don't pay attention so much to the day-to-day, but to the trends, and then you lay on top of that revenue from Bitcoin, you see there's a rough, the correlation is probably a 0.5, and it's kind of a lagging thing. So as the price of Bitcoin trends up over time, you'll see then a couple weeks later, purchases will trend up, and as it trends down, purchases will trend down. So I think this affects the optimism and obviously pessimism of people who own this. And I think one of the reasons also that we brought in so much money at first is the fact that by pure coincidence, the week that we began accepting Bitcoin, it was within 2 or 3 days of the high watermark. It was $1,200 a Bitcoin at the time. That was kind of, in retrospect, we can always see these things were ridiculous, and so that was kind of ridiculous. But so people were just flush with cash, and they were spending a lot with us, and that was great. But we still see we still see a certain correlation between what the trend is and how likely people are to pay. Okay, so are there any questions? Yeah, was that a hand? No? Okay. Oh, go ahead.
Probably a bizarre question, but in your cash management or your treasury operations, do you look at Bitcoin as a foreign currency and manage, or how do you hedge against the price fluctuation when you've taken a receivable in over time? Are you immediately exchanging them out, or are you holding it over time, and how quickly are you managing that cash?
So that's a very good question. When we working with Coinbase, what we receive are dollars. So they take in the Bitcoin, we get dollars. Now, two things to look at with that. There are those in the Bitcoin community that criticize us for that, like, why don't we take Bitcoin? Well, we would love to do that, but currently we can't pay our employees with it, we can't pay the lights, we can't pay our taxes. Although the Utah legislature, quite a progressive body, is actually has, for the second session, is considering a bill that will allow you to pay your state taxes with Bitcoin. So there's that. We can't pay our suppliers with it. We have to take that. But at a principle, we then go out into the market and we look at 10% of what came in on any one week, and then we buy that amount. So we are, in essence, taking 10%. Now,
so that's kind of the way you're hedging.
Well, but as far as actual hedging, we're still waiting for some real credible financial hedging instruments to come along, and we would probably increase that 10% to the 20 or 30% range if there were a way that we could guard against those fluctuations. So
I'm a former currency trader, so
you get it, yeah.
That's why this. I look at this in different ways, and it goes back to how do we define it? Do we define it as a commodity that, from a currency trading perspective, I would, and from the IRS, we would, because commodity you buy and sell, there's capital gains or losses, and those can be taxed appropriately. And then is it a virtual currency, or is it something else? Stored value of some sort.
Well, okay, I'm the spokesman for the company, so this is a personal experience. This hits home. After we started doing this, we got all this free media, all this, an awesome amount of publicity over this. We thought, okay, how can we build on this? Well, we had decided that, okay, let's give employees the opportunity of receiving a portion of their paycheck in Bitcoin. Or at the very least, you know, at the end of next year, we'll if you want to receive your bonus in Bitcoin. So we thought, easy, okay, and so we kind of leaked that to the press, and we had this whole thing, and it was great. So then we said, okay, now we got to get down and let's do this. This should be easy. Well, it turns out it's really hard, because while the IRS, you know, I mean, so take all that, the idea of it being a virtual currency aside, the IRS still, as far as I know, considers it property. And so for the purposes of taxation, it's really complicated. So there are companies that have come along and said, oh, we've figured out a way to do it without being branded money transmitters. And these are the biggest Rube Goldberg schemes you've ever seen. Like, well, we put it here, and then we turn it into this, and then it's a debit card for a little bit, and then we do this, you know, it's like, it's a mess. So yeah, these are things that have to get worked out. So something as simple as giving employees the option of being paid a portion of their paycheck in Bitcoin, no, there's a lot of catching up that has to be
See,
done.
that goes back to what you're saying, well, how you define it. But how you define it is how you use it. Right? So in this case, if they're using it as a payment function, then that's been defined, and its usability, and the usability is there, right? But some of the other ways, and if you want to do two things at once, then there's other regulatory things that come into play, some not as defined as others, and it gets a little bit more complicated,
Yeah,
right?
you can look at the IRS, it's not going to say it's income, they're going to say it's a transfer of property, because they're looking at tax on capital gains versus
Right.
straight income tax, which, yeah, it gets pretty convoluted, particularly for an employee that's not going to have a, you know.
And it's an evolution. It's an evolution of how things evolve, right? And over time, right? You know, it's funny. I told Chris this morning. And I don't know if many of you know this, but do you realize that PayPal started out as a digital currency? That's what their intent was.
Oh, really?
That was their original intent, is to be a new digital currency. And then, you know, they ended up finding eBay and finding here's a group of people we can sell to a lot easier, right? And make our investments work. So my point is, businesses evolve to meet their markets, and this will evolve as a product almost, right? As adoption and acceptance comes along, and understanding is more appreciated.
Oh, yeah.
Do you want to talk about the T0 project at all, or is that Patrick's thing and not yours?
Oh, no, that's my life.
Is it?
Oh, yeah.
Do you want to tell the audience a little bit about the project at all? It did get mentioned, and it's one of your biggest projects right now in the space.
So something I kind of alluded to earlier is this idea that our CEO sort of uniquely put us in a position to be early adopters of this. Well, another component of his makeup is Overstock's a public company, and we're a small public company. We've issued 25 million shares and have revenues of $2 billion, which is small where public companies are concerned still. And one thing we discovered not long after going public is that there's a culture of abuse on Wall Street that where large institutions have figured out how to make money by extracting value out of public companies. There's a way to make money when a share price falls, and they figured out a way to manipulate the market such that the price would fall. And yeah, it's called naked short selling. It's this whole thing, and that equipped us with a real kind of healthy distrust of the way Wall Street works. These centralized institutions that become too big and become essentially unaccountable to regulation. Not even so much unaccountable to regulation as there emerges this phenomenon called regulatory capture. And so we found that the SEC, that you would assume would put an end to this thing, was actually, a sort of a facilitating it in a way. So we, fought against this thing. It's now very, very rare that it happens, so that's on the past. But what this did is we've spent a lot of time looking at the status quo and trying to figure out, are there other ways to go about this? Are there other ways that you can exchange financial instruments such that you don't have to go through these capturable central institutions, one of which is called the Depository Trust Corporation. And we also discovered that a lot of large banks will pay on the order of $1 billion a year to settle stock trades, and it takes 3 days to do it. So this is, this is an inefficient process. So not long after we started accepting Bitcoin, we went on to this website called Reddit, if you know, where there are these events where you can say, ask me anything. And somebody got on and said, why don't you consider looking at Bitcoin technology as a replacement for the way Wall Street currently works, like create an alternative stock exchange. And we thought we should really look into that. So we did. We investigated it and decided about almost exactly a year ago, we decided it was something we were going to do. And we've created an entity we call it T0. It gets that name because currently it takes 3 days for a stock trade to settle. They call that T+3, trade date +3. T0 we call it because using this system, using the blockchain or Bitcoin-like technologies, that settlement happens immediately, or T0. In other words, trade date +0. So yeah, we've figured this out. It works, and we currently have it in front of the SEC. Ironically, trying to get working on getting regulatory approval, and we're going to, play this right up the middle and hope that it we're blazing a trail for those who would follow. So, in other words, if you're looking for businesses that stand to be disrupted by crypto technology, look for any business where middlemen, where intermediaries step in, but between buyer and seller, in order to verify that a transaction is valid, that the correct authority is being exercised, and that so the 4 principles are immutability, provenance, validation, and authority. We currently hire other firms to do this stuff for us, and they take their, they get their due. You see things like that, there are probably opportunities to use the blockchain instead, because that's what the blockchain's really good at, is immutability. In other words, making sure the thing doesn't change. Provenance, which is seeing a direct correlation between the transfer funds, making sure the transactions are valid, and making sure that only people with the authority to transact actually get to make those transactions. This is what blockchain does effortlessly and for for remarkably little cost and in almost no time. So we're using that to try to displace entities on Wall Street that add friction to transactions. So, yeah. Thank you.
Thank you, Joe. Thank you, Judd. Now, Mr. Mao, McKinsey & Company.
So we've talked about a lot of this stuff already. I think I could probably breeze through a number of the things I have. And then I wanted to offer tonight, instead of drinks, if you all want to have a 3-hour discussion on regulatory issues. Would you make that happen? Maybe drinks are good.
Maybe you need drinks before that, right?
Yeah. So just a piece of data or information around transaction value. Like if you look at the number of transactions that take place, so the pure volume, not dollar volume, but transaction volume, cash is still king. You can see all the other things that kind of weave their way through here, with checks having a slow death and cash coming down. But what's interesting is the decline in cash is actually outpaced by the GDP growth that you see. So actual dollars in circulation are larger today than they were last year, which I think people tend to find a bit surprising. So if you look at the total revenues in the payments industry, they're big numbers, right? And I throw this stuff up there just to glance at and look at real quick to say it adds some context into like what's the size of the prize when it comes to cryptocurrency or dollars that shift. And just in the US, you can see these things are huge. When you get at some of the things that we were just hearing about T0, which isn't on these slides, but you'd see similar or larger dollar volumes that take place. So that's what's at stake. When you think about the disruptions in the payments ecosystem, Bitcoin itself or cryptocurrency itself is just one piece of this. There's a number of things that are taking place today that totally transform kind of how people pay for goods and services today, or even who and how you bank with in the long run. So digital is creating this convergence between, like, not only do you think about Uber and what you do today, the payment's gone, right? It's this total convergence of, I have this mobile application, I use it to find a ride, I get to the place I want to go, it does the mapping, and then I just walk out. Right? So all of this stuff gets converged, and we're seeing a fight or a battle for what's that consumer interface that takes place in these sort of things. So, banks are on the back end of what this interface is, and you'll see them start to like struggle and find ways to move themselves back at the front end of this digital convergence that's taking place. Within the payment system, there's also this disruption around. It used to be just a couple of players put a terminal in a merchant's place, or created a way to do an online payment. And now we're seeing all of these other small players. So everybody knows Square. Square's popped up, but there's other little players that have popped up in this space that are changing the way this interface takes place at the point of sale. And the payment itself is maybe less of what's there or less of what a merchant buys. And you may see a merchant buying more of a system now. So, for example, a restaurant may buy a restaurant management software package that happens to process a transaction. So I can use my mobile phone to actually reserve a table, and when I walk in the door, it tells me to go to table 5, and when I get to table 5, it's already told the retailer that, hey, this is a repeat person, they always have a Coke, and the partner has a Sprite, and boom, the waiter, the server comes to your table with the drinks that you wanted, and the payment piece of it isn't why a restaurant bought that platform, but it's there for that restaurant to use. Data analytics and digitization, you think about the data that is now available, and as we've moved to electronic transactions, and crypto can be a piece of this as well, it creates this large pool of information and data that's there. Just thinking what, we were looking at overstock data. 20 years ago, you couldn't pull together that sort of data about who's buying what and when and how and what it is and all of that. And these are players in this space that are looking at monetizing this payments data stream to find ways to increase sales or increase marketing. Nobody's really nailed this one yet. I don't see any players that are like making a killing in the big data space from a payments perspective. But ownership of this information creates an advantage and creates the ability to, whether that's from a loyalty perspective or whether it can drive your marketing engine. There's a number of players here. B2B payments, and this one in particular is where I think cryptocurrencies has got a really interesting play on the B2B side. It's largely been ignored by most players in this space. As Overstock looks at this, there's intermediaries that provide this transfer of funds or pay for services. Banks make a lot of money on this, and there's been very little disruption in this space. And retailers or business providers perceive a high potential for business disruption if they get it wrong. So they continue to pay, right? So putting something in this space that solves the trust or loyalty issues around how a payment can take place and reduces the friction of how that payment can be made has huge potential. Payment network infrastructures are changing. So around the world, we're seeing people move, like the US system, the entire system is a batch-based system. Some countries have already moved to a real-time system. The US has proposed some real-time systems. So we're seeing this shift in how, from a batch system to a real-time system, and what are the implications of that. And there's this little company called Ripple that is using a similar blockchain type approach to do nearly instant transfers of dollars across borders. And they've actually signed some banks and are doing these transfers actually right now between a small bank in New Jersey and a bank in Germany. So they've solved a lot of these issues around how to create a faster payment system, at least on the back end side of things. We talked a bit about payment security. big retailers like Target see their brand tarnished simply because of these breaches in security. EMV is, I don't know if you guys know, October, there's this liability shift that takes place with EMV that can kind of lock down card-present transactions, but other countries that have gone through this see huge spikes in card-not-present fraud, and we're starting to see that, like this year, it's continually ramped up so that's another thing that needs to be solved. EMV solves just a large dollar flow of that, but not necessarily.
Not where the fraud is.
Not where the fraud is, right. Yeah, fraudsters are great, right? Because when you lock down a channel, they don't just go and like get a job at McDonald's or quit doing fraud. They just look, where's the next thing to go after and strike towards?
Fraud's like water.
Yeah.
It finds the lowest point and the fastest opening. Block it off, it goes to the next one.
Nice analogy.
Yeah, and when I talked with like large banks or network clients of mine, they always say, we're impervious, we've never been breached. And I say, you've never been breached because you're not the easiest target.
Right.
Or they don't know it.
Yeah, or they don't know it. Yeah.
Enriched target, you're not.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
So, and then the last trend, mega trend here that we see is underbanked, millennials, they deal with things differently, right? So 10 years ago, we didn't even have a term underbanked. So there's a huge exploding population of people that have rejected the traditional banking system for a number of reasons, one of which is that it's tough to really control or understand the penalty fees and how much banking costs you. And now you're starting to see some players in this market start to create consumer-friendly products for this particular market segment. And it's big and it's growing, and depending on where you look at, you're talking many millions, if not 100 million people in the near future that fit this particular category. So payments is the hot sector. You see all of these companies that are small and growing, and bringing this back to cryptocurrency, there's hundreds of millions of dollars that are being invested in Silicon Valley today around cryptocurrency. And over the next 12 to 18 months, you'll see different interfaces rolling out and things rolling out to really make cryptocurrency and probably Bitcoin right at the fingertips of consumers and easier for merchants and small businesses to accept. And it kind of, we've talked a bit about there's lots of different cryptocurrencies out there. The fact of the matter is when that sort of level of investment starts to take place around a particular cryptocurrency, Bitcoin, it's tough to kind of shift and make something else, even if it's better, supplant the effort that's going into that particular sector now. So am I going too fast? Do people have, great, good. And non-financial institutions are jumping into this space as well, and they largely leverage like we've talked about KYC and AML and regulatory things. They just link it to a bank account and then just piggyback on all of those activities that a bank has to perform anyway to keep themselves kind of within the bounds of legality on here. So what's happening in the space around digital wallets with Apple, Amazon, Facebook? They've all rolled out with their own version of this or where they're playing in this space. And if you think about what's happening around how they want to participate, Apple wants to sell handsets. And their Apple Wallet is all about creating a user experience that is second to none and makes people want to go buy handsets. Right? Amazon wants to dominate, I apologize, they want to dominate the online commerce space, and they roll out things like Amazon Register and other things for other players where they can collect data from other players in this space to be able to see what's going on, but ultimately they want to sell more goods. And Facebook and what they do with their payments platform is to make sure you don't go anywhere else, right? They don't want you to leave the Facebook environment into another environment to complete a transaction at the risk of like losing you as a customer or as an engaged consumer. And then what's not on this list yet is, what we're seeing with Samsung rolling out with their wallet. I think you'll see Microsoft make a move here. And it's less about the wallet. And don't think about like the transaction or the digital wallet, but think about the environment and what these people are trying to accomplish. And the payment side of things, I don't care if they make $1 off of it or not. They're reinforcing other value propositions and trying to keep you within their digital environment or infrastructure, to whether it's sell more software or handsets or more goods online.
But if you think about it, that's an element of loyalty and retail retention, right? So one of the things I think you mentioned early on is core to heart for me, which was about that integration and how things are becoming, especially with payments. It's not really becoming about the payments. It's not becoming about the wallet. Actually, I hate the word wallet because it's not a product. It's just a feature, functionality. But those things are integrating within business lines. So each vertical market and each area of commerce has its own integrations through tools and through features that in essence is to capture that customer and keep that loyal to that customer. So loyalty really is something that most people have missed in the previous years, where it's not about counting points and how many times you come back. It's about having that stickiness, that customer that says, I want to go back there. I like them so much because they give me all this extra stuff, or they give me freebies or whatever. It's like the Facebook is that, they want you to be so involved in that environment. It's kind of like that little picture, that meme you see on Facebook for that matter, as the guy that's basically a skeleton that says, I'm waiting for my wife to get off Facebook so we can cook dinner or something like that. It's the point is that stickiness, because people become addicted almost, to Candy Crush or whatever they're doing, and so why leave that environment? And they actually gauge their environment about how many hours you spend per day in their system. So that's really the goal. So the rest of it is just the afterthought.
So infrastructure players are evolving as well. And here you've got a few quotes from Amex, Visa, around how their traditional approach to the market is difficult in the day and age of tokenization and data breaches, the challenge that they view from other networks like cryptocurrency, other things that are coming up. And then if you look into Europe and Asia, there's a number of countries that have just taken a government view of creating a network or an infrastructure and saying this is cost-based only, there's no profit in this, there's no revenue model, and it's all about efficiency. So I whizzed through that super fast so I could get to some of these slides about cryptocurrency. And I wanted to get to this slide because we've talked a lot about what are some of the different things that are out there today. And I think this is a good slide to put structure around what any currency is. It's actually comprised of these four components, and then we can look at these four components of a currency and make an assessment as to, where does a cryptocurrency fall, or where does Bitcoin fall in this place. So first of all, it's a store of value, right? I get paid in dollars, and if I want to hold on to them under my mattress or put them in my bank account, I kind of know what they're going to be worth today, tomorrow, or a month from now. So a currency has to be a store of value. Bitcoin historically has been a pretty horrible store of value. Over the last year, it's been fairly consistent in the $200 to $300 range. So it's getting much better as a store of value. But still, players like Overstock want to get paid in dollars, or because of a number of reasons, or because of variation of currency. So does it pass on a store of value? Yeah, maybe it's better than if your money was in Argentine dollars, but it is compared to U.S. dollars. I think I'd rather have them in U.S. dollars. So it also is a currency, or something that I can trade for a good or a service. So can I walk down to the Starbucks and use Bitcoin to buy my coffee? And I think here is where it's the biggest failure, right? So there's a lot of places that accept Bitcoin. Most of them are online, but it's not enough, right? It's such a small fraction of the overall economy, that it makes it difficult for somebody to say, I'm going to live off of Bitcoin, so it kind of fails on the currency side of things. Now, the next two are probably the most interesting one. So as a network, it's got to enable the transaction. You've got to be able to kind of use it or move the money from one place to another. And here is the place that I think is the biggest innovation in Bitcoin, right? So you think about what Visa had to do in the 60s when they created their own network, was literally go out and lay cable down between stores and nodes and move all this stuff. Today, they use, a very similar approach. Internet's created a little more automated, but not much. Most of the large retailers that are doing credit card transactions are still using dedicated, T whatever lines to be able to pass that information. Bitcoin does it seamlessly with all of the investments that are there for internet. There's literally no cost to this outside of what the miners put into the system. So that to me is probably one of the biggest innovations in this space, is the efficiency of using what's already there and using it fairly flawlessly and quickly. So A+ on the network side of things. The last one is a ledger of record, or your ability to track information and transactions. We saw the kind of double entry ledger method of doing this stuff. And again, on ledger of record, it keeps track of every transaction that ever takes place and ties that back to the coin itself. Pretty phenomenal. And I was going to talk a bit about, there's so many other things that you can do with this, like if you were a new company starting out, instead of offering stock on the stock exchange, you could offer your 21 million shares of whatever company it is and just copy the blockchain to be able to offer your own stock from that perspective, which pretty phenomenal. There's other things that are interesting about different ways to use a Bitcoin currency because of its efficiency. The network and the ledger of record is use it to track ownership of digital content. Or, you've got, you can tell me, how many characters do you have? 42 characters?
In what, an address, or in what?
Within a blockchain entry that's
It depends
open?
on the encoding. In terms of the transaction status, or in terms of the address size?
When you have a ledger entry.
It depends on the protocol. I mean, I've seen, there's a lot of answers to that one.
So there is some groups that are using a blockchain approach to be able to establish certain legal entries within a point in time, and then, contracts, and then just have a key that's separate from this to say when these characters are present in this transaction in this location, then.
You're talking about multi-sig.
There you go.
Right now it's 3. It's 3 is the max, but the max in like another year will be like 14 or something. So you're close.
It's exciting stuff for a guy who's not an IT or a tech geek. So this is a transaction, and you guys have seen this before earlier today. I think what's important is the on-ramp and the off-ramp here, because this is the tricky part, right? That's where you've got to make sure you comply with all the regulations and the rules. It's also the point where there's still some friction in the system. So Coinbase, they can offer a merchant near zero cost of acceptance. Well, because they have the online wallet and they're charging somebody 1% to bring the money into the wallet. So, Coinbase is still making money on a transaction where, the merchant isn't paying. It's exactly the opposite of what you have when you use a credit card transaction, where the merchant bears all of the cost of the transaction and finances the reward that the issuer is then giving the cardholder. So it's a complete reversal of what, a traditional credit card transaction is in this space, which is also why it's exciting for retailers to use, because they shift the cost. It's seemingly more equitable from how you would expect a typical transaction to take place. There's no chargebacks. Once the transaction is done, it's final, and there's no CFPB guidelines around what you would have to do for consumer protections in this sort of thing, which interestingly kind of begs the question of, if I'm a consumer, why would I ever use a Bitcoin to do a transaction? Because I don't have any of the protections that I would have if I used a credit card or something else. So application of technology, the most interesting stuff around network and ledger of record kind of leads you to where I think cryptocurrency is headed. I think the idea of it being something that I buy goods and services with, that the average consumer uses every day, as dominating from a payments perspective, is a long way ahead and has a very slow growth ramp. What doesn't necessarily have a slow growth ramp that might be closer in is the blockchain being used as a backstop for intrabank trading or ACH replacement or some of the other traditional infrastructure plays that take place today within the banking system, because it is secure, distributed. You've got a public ledger, so anybody can see what's happening in this space. And this approach can largely be used like an intrabank transfer. Instead of it being a public ledger, it's a ledger that's public to the 5,000 banks that are currently doing business in the US, and not to every consumer. And this is the space that I think cryptocurrency has the most short-term potential to be disruptive and to change the landscape. We currently, the banking infrastructure is on a hub and spoke clearing system today, where everything passes through one central agency, and each payment method or transaction method kind of uses a different hub or a different agency to accomplish this. But that's the advantage of moving to a crypto or a distributed network approach, is you become much more efficient at being able to make these transfers, and you can do them quicker, intraday settlements, instant stuff, without completely rebuilding the entire infrastructure to move from batch hub and spoke system and try to recreate that same approach in a real-time approach. Is this as exciting as regulatory stuff now? So anybody familiar with Ripple or has seen kind of how they do? Yeah, so Ripple is a company that's doing exactly this. They don't use exactly the blockchain approach. There's some technical differences for how they do it. But in a sense, they use the same approach of using different nodes to be able to solve the whole question of trust and reliability. Which, interestingly, if people want to, or kind of scratching their heads over like what exactly does cryptocurrency solve and why is it different, just Google Byzantine general's dilemma, and just reading through kind of what the dilemma is kind of makes it clear as to why cryptocurrencies are so revolutionary in solving an age-old problem of how do I trust the information that I'm getting from somebody. I don't think any of these slides, I really want to get to your section. Yeah. So I don't know if any of these slides are worth going through, because we've largely talked about the rest of the stuff. So if people have questions, great, fire them out. Otherwise, we'll move on.
All right.
Cool.
What's my time looking like? Do I have to make this quick? I have a little bit of time? 25 minutes. I had to make it a little quicker than I originally planned, but yeah. Just real quick, I like to do this before I do any talk. How many people here have purchased a Bitcoin, or in part or in full? Awesome. So I was at the American Banker Conference on digital currencies a month ago, and more than 50% of that audience raised their hands. Now, it was a conference on digital currency, but then again, so is this room. So I would strongly advise any of you to buy $20 worth of Bitcoin and make a purchase at Overstock or something like that, just so that you see what the checkout procedure is like and understand. You spent 4 hours here today. It's a very good use of your time to understand what the future will bring in terms of reducing friction for retail transactions, and I would definitely give you that as homework. But a little bit about me. I am Krista Rose. I am a very minor Bitcoin celebrity. I talk a lot at conferences. I am an author. I've written in many of the publications in this space. Currently, I'm writing for American Banker. And I am a programmer as well. I've run a computer consulting company for most of my life. We've done a lot of work over the years, some work for NGOs and federal government, et cetera. I got into Bitcoin full-time-ish about 2 years ago. I've been following it since 2010, and I've learned a lot, and so I like to share that with people. Today, I get to do the fun part, which is prognosticating about the future of Bitcoin, which is really a lot of fun, I think. I'm a little bit skeptical on some things. You'll see a lot of rampant idealism in the movement, and that's really kind of dangerous, and it'll lead you down the wrong path. I stay away from the politics as much as I can, which is very hard in this sort of future. I think this future is a good ways away, though probably not as far as you think. I don't know if we're talking 5 years or 15 years, something in there probably. And a little bit about myself as well. I'm a big believer in the Chicago School of Economics. That puts me at odds with a lot of like the libertarians who are typically Misans or Austrians. My entire world is seen through the scope of the efficient market hypothesis. I always look for where the efficiencies are. Thus far, that's worked out really well for me. So we don't have to get into all of that, but this future, as I see it, I think is where the efficiencies lie in Bitcoin, which in my mind is the most important thing you're going to do if you want to prognosticate. Since a lot of you guys are a little bit new, I'll make this relatively quick, but the earliest forms of Bitcoin was as a currency. I don't actually think it's a currency per se, although it's kind of a bad question. Beaver pelts were a currency at some point, so were seashells. So a currency is what you want it to be. There's this chartalist view of currency, which is you pay your taxes in a currency, and that which you don't pay your taxes is not a currency. So we don't pay our taxes in Bitcoin. That might be your definition of currency, I don't know. But in the earliest stages of the movement, currencies were the entirety of the application of Bitcoin. And you saw that really proceed throughout, really 2010, I think, was when the first retail purchase was actually made online. Lazarus spent what is now $1 million or $2 million on a pizza, and that was a very famous first purchase. It seems like a silly purchase, but the whole story is that $1 or $2 million was just a small fraction of his Bitcoin earnings. So he gets the accolade of having probably invested a very good amount in proving this is a payment mechanism, which of course is why we're all here in some capacity. You saw then companies like BitPay and Bitpagos start to appear in this sort of payment mechanism world, and Coinbase as well. And Coinbase and these companies are providing services to Bitcoiners, but it's a very small market, this payment mechanism right now. It is tiny. Certainly in the sort of mainstream space. And the biggest success in that space thus far is probably Bitpagos. Bitpagos is a reverse payment processor. I love this company. It's really cool. What they do is they take credit cards from American tourists in difficult Latin American countries, such as Venezuela and Argentina, and they pay the merchant in Bitcoin. So they do the opposite of what you would think. Rather than take Bitcoin and give you fiat, they take fiat and give you Bitcoin. And then you ask yourself, well, what is the efficiency of that? And this will build towards a theme throughout the presentation, but what they're doing is essentially using the blockchain as a payment mechanism in a way of circumventing the regulations in that local zone. This is a form of regulatory arbitrage. They're an American company. They owe little to nothing to the Argentinian regulatory framework, and they're providing efficiency to that market. This is particularly pronounced in the case of Venezuela, where that entire economy is just dysfunctional, and they are finding a lot of efficiencies to be made there. I think that's their biggest market right now. We'll see if that business model continues or not, but it is the type of creativity that I think that your industry probably hasn't seen too much of, at least not as much recently, and that is a very cool model for Bitcoin as a payment mechanism right now. I think that as a payment mechanism, it'll grow from there. But again, this gets into the next point, which is that Bitcoin has been servicing markets that were otherwise unserviced. Certainly you see that in the most blatant examples with things like Silk Road. You also see that with Backpage. Backpage is sort of a notoriously shady site here that deals with escorting and whatnot, and Bitcoin is being used as a payment mechanism there. These are underserviced customers. We will probably see it grow from these extremes towards a center. This is what happened with the internet in the 90s. The internet was for porn until it wasn't. And we see that happening right now with Bitcoin. So in this third phase of Bitcoin that I put here in our past, it's Bitcoin as a counterparty agent. So we think of what counterparty agents are now, and and there are companies like Visa and Amex and MasterCard. These are places that can be subpoenaed, these are places that have buildings, and these are places that are very subject to the regulatory frameworks that you all are very familiar with. And a lot of the companies in this sort of like third phase of our past were starting to use Bitcoin then as a counterparty agent itself. And so the framework of their business models or their usage scenarios were such that the regulatory enforcement actions, given our current environment, must be levied against the blockchain. Good luck finding that address, and that's somebody else's problem, not the proprietors. This is their attitude. I don't know if this will be sustainable or not, but this is what we see. We are now in a current stage of Bitcoin as a decentralized ledger, which is a cool stage, and you see this. This is why I asked Judd here to bring up what he's doing with the T0 project at some degree. This notion that we can use the blockchain not just for transfers of value per se, so much as the exchange of accounts due, balances, and passing messages along those lines. And that's kind of where we're at right now, is in exploring that phase. More on that later. So, I'm not one of the typical Bitcoiners in that I don't believe that decentralization is always more efficient. I believe that economies of scale often work very well. I believe that middlemen often add value. I believe, though, that there are many cases where decentralization works very well and does present an economic efficiency. It so happens that decentralized networks are very accurate. Where accuracy is needed, certainly in the Bitcoin model, Bitcoin performs well and probably better than centralized institutions most of the time, not always. You see this in various forms of, well, at least these could be features, I would suppose, and you guys know more about this even, but FTDs and such, whereby the value did not make it for one of a number of reasons. Maybe some paperwork didn't go through, credit analysis failed, I don't know. You won't have that problem on the Bitcoin blockchain. You will always deliver. Again, decentralization works where there are high-risk scenarios. You see high risk, of course, in these underserviced markets. And again, inefficient markets where there aren't examples of markets where there aren't a lot of efficient options for people that have to use Bitcoin. You see this now, of course, in like Backpage or something. They had their card processing pulled, and so you see Bitcoin providing an efficiency there because it is not an entity that can be subject to determining whether or not they are worth doing business with. So you'll see that now. Again, this goes back to also servicing credit card contracts in Venezuela, which I would imagine is an inefficient market, underserviced, et cetera, where regulations are inefficient. And again, that builds towards the story of censored markets is where we're seeing it now. Where centralization works, mostly the opposite, where risk is low. Centralization works really well where there are efficient options for recourse, meaning if I was due an amount, that amount did not come, I can pursue regulatory action or I can sue somebody. Where there's courts, there's a system of support, et cetera. Centralization is very fast. Blockchains are typically fairly slow, not always, and there's a lot of options, but most of the options for making blockchains faster have to do with designating some authority for the purposes of reducing latency in the transaction. So centralization is fast, and that probably won't change immediately. It may change over time. Centralization works where accuracy is not imperative, at least in like very quick terms, where again, there are options for recourse, and so that we can extend credit in various ways to perhaps enable a bit of a fudge and a risk factor when dealing with clients. And again, where regulations offer efficiency. If in fact the regulations are creating depth to the market, so like most securities markets would typically have this benefit, the regulations are adding security to that market with trust and reputation services, et cetera, that's where centralization tends to work very well is when it actually is providing value to the actors in the market. But in the theme of all of these sort of designations, settlement is probably the #1 function of Bitcoin. There are other functions to be clear, but settlement is the theme. So settlement of value itself in the form of Bitcoin or in the form of messages and accounts on top of Bitcoin. That's typically the rubric that you will see Bitcoin play some function. You will see people that say that it'll be used for like electronic medical records and things like that. I think that that's a bit of a stretch. It may very well happen at some point, but I don't think that that's going to happen efficiently soon. And whenever you see claims about the blockchain that are making claims outside of the settlement functions, you should be skeptical of those. They have yet to appear and manifest in any significant way. So yeah, where settlement matters, I don't have to tell you guys this, but I think that there's a little bit of a distinction here in Bitcoin that probably deserves to be discussed. Settlement matters, I think, in the blockchain world between banks. Now, not the banks you're thinking of, and we'll get that to a second, but particularly where trust is low. Again, if you have value in a community bank in Venezuela, I don't know how you would necessarily extend trust lines for that bank into the existing system, if not through something that can't be reversed, a settlement that is immediate, and that is a function of Bitcoin. That's a theme that you will see throughout. High-risk value transfers as well. I would also suggest too, one of the markets that the blockchain will probably service are that of, say, like the immigrants that are a little bit of questionable provenance here in the country. These are people that don't have access to traditional banking services, who are probably locked out of buying a lot of things online. And then that too plays into this notion of remittance. I do think that blockchains will be very efficient for remittance. I think that it will play a different role than most people expect. I think a lot of people see Western Union and MoneyGram as being remittance providers that are not displaced, and they certainly add a lot of value in the existing environment. But what I think will happen is that they will be displaced completely over time by banks that are actually issuing US dollars on the blockchain. We have some banks doing that now. I think the T0 project is doing that. In fact, you have your own dollars, right? Yeah, over color coins. Right, and there's another USD asset called Tether that is on the blockchain. So we talk about volatility as maybe being an issue in the scheme of things. I don't believe that it is, because you can issue US dollars onto the Bitcoin network, and you can translate it through the Bitcoin network using Bitcoin only as payment rails. I believe that that model ultimately will probably displace the need for most remittance services. And if you're wondering why a company like Coinbase got a valuation of $100-something million, it's probably in some model like that, whereby they will be servicing customers that aren't being serviced by American banks now in countries that have very poorly developed finance systems, banks and such. They will probably be receiving dollars from Americans onto the Bitcoin network. If they want to actually transfer that into paper money, what they'll probably do is go to their local bodega. They'll have Wells Fargo dollars or Citibank dollars on their phone listed adjacent to their Bitcoin. They will go to the bodega owner, who will give them 99 cents on that dollar. That bodega owner will himself either have a relationship that they can pull that money into their account via ACH, or they will, one way or another, receive that value by selling it upstream to the next person who does have a banking relationship. And again, this builds into the theme of regulatory arbitrage at some level. This is not arbitraging the United States regulations in that case, but those of these countries that are very difficult. And I think there's a lot of social good to that function too. Regulatory arbitrage isn't necessarily a bad thing, particularly when you have people, say in Venezuela, who are not being serviced by the banking system. And again, these are high-risk transfers currently. Those are remittance payments that you would be paying a substantial percentage on. Remittance between the United States and, I don't know, England is very cheap, but remittance between the United States and Venezuela, not so much. So that is a place where settlement really matters, I think, in this blockchain model. Another place settlement really, really matters that I'm very excited about personally is that where the risk and the value is just not defined or understood. You'll see this in online banks. Right now, we have banks online. This brings, I think, your point earlier. Gaming is the quintessential example. People earn World of Warcraft money, or they earn Minecraft money or something like that. Like, how do you quantify the risk of transmitting that value between like this 13-year-old and that 9-year-old? I mean, is that an economic function that's productive? Well, that remains to be seen. But the need is there, and there's never been a protocol to do these types of transfers. There's no reason why your kid shouldn't be able to trade in different currencies from different games. And I'll build on this theme a little bit more, because I think that that's really the market for a lot of these very exotic services that you'll see the Bitcoin network servicing. And that gets, again, into where the asset price discovery is inefficient and the market is shallow. You're not going to be able to come up with a regulatory model or any kind of risk analysis for what a Minecraft sword is worth or something like that. There's a need for it. The market will find it if that option is available, but nobody in this room wants to do that, at least not right now. So yeah, what banks fit this model? Again, online banks, they're everywhere. I think that online banks are going to be more and more prominent. We probably will never call them banks, but they are certainly banks. When I got into Bitcoin, I wasn't enthralled with the banking system. I didn't hate banks. My only exposure to them was very minimal. I didn't realize what went into that whole process. And then as I started to learn more about what banks do and how money is sent throughout the economy and on, I realized that there's a lot of parallels online that just have no actual industry around it. And there's no industry around it because there's never been the option or the protocol or the standards by which to do that. And truthfully, I don't know that it's even legal for these banks to settle. I don't know that there's there's enough value there for anybody to care, but there's also no framework by which Blizzard, the company that makes World of Warcraft, can approach any sort of regulatory agency and ask them for permission or clarity on how they can transmit to other games. These things are very apparent if you have children. You can look at your average teenager's Xbox, and you can realize that he does business with the Bank of Microsoft. He has tons of game items, he has points, they're good for in-game purchases, they're attention units of some kind. Often somebody perhaps made a video that was very popular and they end up getting a badge for it. These are tokens of scarcity. They're very hard to quantify in any real meaningful term because there's no settlement that's done. This is within a silo. So I expect that what we'll see is that these silos will start to open and we'll have price discovery amongst these weird banks and institutions. I think that what will happen too is that you'll see specialization of labor in weird ways. I think that your kids will have jobs that'll be probably pretty unintelligible to you, but they'll be providing service, adding liquidity and depth to markets that you didn't know existed. You will find them trading outside of these institutions on forums, on websites. They will be maybe performing various forms of arbitrage, gambling, I'm certain. I wouldn't doubt that at all. These are models that are going to be provided by the blockchain, and these are models that can't be provided by centralized institutions. They have to be settled out of the network. And two, some of the other minor things, people want to sometimes back up their value. You may want to export your Candy Crush points and keep them in your safety deposit box. I don't know. There are things like this online, and you have to trust the institution to keep them for you. But with blockchain, with Bitcoin, you can print these things out, and you can keep the private key and put them in a safety deposit box, just like you do anything else. And this is the type of settlement that the blockchain enables. I believe that online asset exchanges are going to become very powerful. There's a card gaming company called Spells of Genesis, and they're really just a speck on the radar. They're a blip, but they're a very forward-thinking company. For anybody who's seen the trading card games, Magic the Gathering or something, that's essentially what they're doing, but they're doing it online through iPads and such. And they're issuing the cards themselves as assets on the blockchain. And a couple things are happening online. These people across the world are trading them through the decentralized exchange, which they're out there. There's no central clearinghouse. These are people who have a card that is a valuable card who's trading them for like 4 less valuable cards. These things are going on, and it's really neat to watch. And before you trivialize it and saying that this is just the passion of teenagers, understand that the reason that it is just the passion of teenagers is because the technology is only accessible to teenagers. I think that as they grow and as they have the problems that you have, they will have solutions to the problems that you have. I certainly see that even myself, and I can see this in various ways already, and we'll probably get into those. Yeah, and this builds towards another theme that I think is really poorly reported on in the news, which is that millennials hate banks. I have seen this many times, and I always groan when I see it because, banks are such a necessary function in the economy. It's a silly thing to suggest, in my mind, that we will just throw them out the window. But I do think that the nature of what a bank is will change. And you look at children today, and I see this, you've all seen this sort of iPad effect, where there's a kid who's not literate, who is more proficient at the iPad than most of us are. And they see that thing, and they move things around. They don't even know the words, but they know the icons. They'll start bringing up YouTube videos and this, that, and the other thing. For that generation, their comprehension of money is dramatically different than yours. When I was growing up, I'm barely a millennial, barely. I might be a Gen Xer. I learned that money was specie, is I think the Austrian term for it, or any economic term. It took up space. This was a thing that was a material, and that the numbers that were in a bank account just represent, in a vault somewhere, I guess the kind that Scrooge McDuck would swim in with his coins. That's what you come to think of what money is. And I think a lot of the regulatory environment is really based on this notion that money is something that takes up space. But you look at the average kid now, and he has a banking relationship at age 4 with one of these games, Fruit Ninja, or one of these others. And yeah, it's play money, but that is how their comprehension of money works. They don't necessarily care about things that take up space the way that we did. And I think that it's an extension from that we will see that they have tons of bank accounts. And as these banks start to settle, I think you'll see a lot of really cool and neat applications and markets. Certainly, millennials have stopped using the dollar as a payment mechanism. We're all here because the dollar is not servicing them as a payment mechanism. Typically, too, the dollar is a funny kind of thing. When people use the dollar, they're typically using it for some form of regulatory arbitrage. Typically, not always. In many cases, it's getting out of sales tax, sometimes income tax, etc. It's not something that I would would advocate in any way, but it's worth noting that that is the function of the paper dollar in some cases. It's probably for the majority of the population. You look at the store of value functions, that again is a regulatory arbitrage function. Typically people in underserviced countries are using the dollar to store value because their own banks are not dependable. So we have this theme building around Bitcoin, I think, and I think that this will converge over time. Again, this is alongside a trend here on Wall Street. Again, Wall Street is loving Bitcoin. It solves problems. Primarily, settlement is what's being looked at now in the theme. Auditability is great. I think that there's a lot of value to transparency. For Wall Street, the big thing that, again, I don't think he's even touched on yet in this, and this could be itself a 4-hour talk, is smart contracts. Smart contracts are featured to cryptocurrencies that are absolutely amazing. Money has, up until now, been just tokenized. These are things that have no logic. They're as interesting in today's day and age as the newspaper was in the 90s relative to the modern web page. Of course, the modern web page shows all kinds of things that are not needed in a currency sense, but there's a version of that that's called smart contracts. What smart contracts are pieces of code that attach to your money. And when you spend them, the agreement is kept between the parties, the receiver and the sender, at some level, to handle that code in a very specific way. So the most trivial example might be this dollar goes into the Bitcoin network, and subject to the outcome of the ball game, if my team wins, I get the dollar back. If their team wins, they get the dollar back. So we both do this, and before you know it, you have a bet that's being executed by the network. You've used the Bitcoin network as a counterparty agent. There is no risk whatsoever of not being paid out because the network is completely impartial, because the mining network absolutely ensures that. There's no ability to alter that term whatsoever. That's the easiest example. I use gambling because everybody knows what a gambling contract is, and they can see how there's a lot of risk involved in gambling. Wall Street likes it for this purpose because a lot of financial contracts will execute in the same way. Right now, there's a ton of waste that is dealing with the risk management of terms of contracts based on events in the market. And smart contracts will close that inefficiency in very little time, is my suspicion. This is a 5-year thing out. This is not a 15-year thing. And you can see that happening, I think, with T0. We actually have a shared history of some level. I work with Counterparty. I'm sure you're quite aware of us. The Counterparty project is an open source project. It started out anonymously, much like Bitcoin itself. The original developers eventually came out, and they themselves still work on the project. They started to work with Overstock. They went separate ways, for lack of a better description, and now they're competing at some level. And they're not competing at all levels. Like, I think what they're doing is more around the smart contract basis. What you're doing is more around the transparency basis. Is that more or less correct?
Yeah, ours is token-based transactions.
Right.
So basically taking shares of stock and converting them to something that trades like Bitcoin, tokenizing them, and then where smart contracts, we're not competing.
Right. Perfect. So exactly. So that is the efficiency. And something I will say too is that smart contracts themselves are typically some form of regulatory arbitrage. Again, they are not necessarily in any way breaking the law, but they are certainly preventing expenditures and waste by way of automating things that otherwise would have gone through the court systems, probably. That being said, I envision that smart contracts will probably extend into other markets very quickly. I could foresee online these being very useful, and not just for gambling. I could foresee smart contracts being any number of things. Files that are paid for based on whether or not they transmitted. Maybe you want to pay for a file, but you don't trust the other person, they don't trust you. What you do is you pay the Bitcoin network, you say, when this file has been transferred to me, at that time the funds will be relinquished to the other party. I think a lot of applications like that. Again, I think that a lot of exotic assets will be forthcoming here. I think that as we have markets that were unable to be traded on existing markets, things like trading cards in one example, but also maybe even just ad impressions. Let's say you yourself are a advertising network or something, and you want to provide some kind of odd sort of commodity that represents advertising space. Things like this that are scarcity online. I think that those will absolutely become parts of more substantial and more mainstream assets that are traded, securities, et cetera, by banks that are now using the New York Stock Exchange exclusively, maybe. Yeah, I think that this does culminate to something that could be very revolutionary here in your industry. I would like to see this technology mature to the point where the liquidity and the depth of these markets for these odd assets get to a point to where a person heads to their local bodega or their convenience store. They open their Bitcoin wallet, and in their Bitcoin wallet, they see all of their Bitcoin. They see some dollars from Wells Fargo. They see some dollars from Citibank, maybe. They see their Minecraft gems, and so forth. They go to the point of sale terminal. The point of sale terminal displays a QR code that displays the price of a good in Bitcoin. It is itself on the shelf denominated probably in dollars, but in terms of the actual interface that it provides to the machine, it'll say, okay, this is the price in Bitcoin, it's good for this amount of time. The person then selects his Minecraft gems. His Bitcoin wallet sells the Minecraft gems on the markets instantaneously or very quickly. Those Minecraft gems are then converted to some amount in Bitcoin. The Bitcoin then transfers through the network to the vendor's point of sale terminal, at which point that Bitcoin will maybe be converted right back into dollars for the vendor, or perhaps even, I don't know, like a Vanguard S&P 500 fractional share or something like that perhaps, depending on what that merchant wants. You'll be able to choose these repositories if there's enough liquidity, if there's enough depth, and if the software gets to be good enough to actually enable this. This is what the technology provides. I can't attest to what the regulations will allow, and that's really the big battle is where and how the regulations will be drawn up. But certainly the technology will progress to a point where that is an option for people. And I think that's very exciting. I don't know exactly where the efficiencies will be there, but I'm sure there will be plenty. I think that this kind of begs the question of what is Bitcoin? I mean, in this crazy far-off world, what is Bitcoin itself now? Is it a currency? Is it a commodity? Certainly, the Bitcoin network is immutable data. All of this springs from that truth. It is data that can't be modified by anybody. That is how we perform these functions. That is how we perform the security of the smart contracts executing. That's how we perform the security of value transferring. It is the truth that has been declared on the network that nobody in the world can change or say otherwise. And the network will perform that function, and that's that. And then, more specifically, if the Bitcoin network provides that function, what is Bitcoin itself? To which the easiest answer that I can come up with is probably that it's real estate, that it itself, either in a cash flow model or otherwise, when you have Bitcoin, you have some degree of ability to participate on that network. Trace amounts will be required to perform these functions, or even large amounts will be required when messages need to decompose into value and vice versa. And I think that that's probably the model that we'll see for most Bitcoining and most blockchain functions going forward. I'll take a quick diversion here in competing protocols. There's a battle in the movement. It's a very political battle over what a blockchain is. Is it a blockchain? Is it the blockchain? Is it just the word blockchain? And nobody really knows. This is kind of akin again to the 90s. We had a lot of protocols back then. There wasn't the internet per se. We had things like Token Ring, and we had IPX, SPX, and there weren't nearly as many of those networks as there are blockchains now. However, at the same time, there aren't now any blockchains other than Bitcoin that are as substantially successful as you see Bitcoin to be relative to some of these other institutions. There are thousands of these literally. I picked a couple because these are kind of the big ones right now in terms of what their philosophy is. Ripple, the problem that I have with it is that it's centralized and there's no work that goes into it. Quite simply, Ripple can be subpoenaed. And though that is probably a positive function given the current regulatory environment now, the problem is you can't build a lot of exotic apps on it. And they've been subpoenaed a number of times already, which again gets into the point. If your blockchain has a mailing address, then there's culpability and you won't be able to perform counterparty risk reduction to the same degree as other networks. Other than that, it's actually pretty decent software. I suspect that what will happen is that the inefficiencies that we see in the current settlement systems will apply to Ripple. I think that what you see in these value captures by the economic rent-seeking institutions that are performing settlement represent the risk models that they have and a small amount of profit, not much. I think that there's a lot of regulatory encumbrances, and I think that Ripple will be subject to all of those because Ripple is, again, subpoenaable. They like to claim that they're decentralized. I don't believe it. There's 5 servers that control most of the validation in that network, and all of the currency belongs to them. Ethereum is a very exciting project that I think is too ambitious. There's a lot of science that goes into these blockchain designs, and Ethereum is probably, and I'm getting, you can speak up, guys. Time is almost up. So yeah. I think that the best way to probably end this is to follow the liquidity. The companies that have been making money for better and worse are the ones that are bringing value into the system. So you look at like Coinbase, they're very successful. They're bringing liquidity into the Bitcoin network. For better and worse, you saw this with the darknet markets. They were very profitable because they were opening the market depth to new actors. We don't need that kind of activity, of course, but I think that what will happen is there will be banks that service very select clients. I'm hoping video games are the next one that you'll see some people making money with. Those, again, would be underserviced clients that are being brought into this network. I think the regulations obviously will be tantamount to whatever you're doing. There's a larger discussion here on the role of the internet in the year 2015. Disruption is what we do in Silicon Valley. That is what we do. We find ways of subverting markets in ways that provide a better quality for customers at the expense of somebody else. You see that expense now coming at expense to a lot of government services. Uber is one fantastic example of this. Uber has, in fact, broken a lot of codes relating to public transit, and they've provided a better service in doing it. It made everybody happy, but it did come at some degree of regulatory overhaul. They're still fighting that out through courts. I think you'll see the same stuff happen with Bitcoin companies. Airbnb is another one. They themselves found an efficiency by circumventing a lot of zoning laws. And I think we can have this discussion as a country. Again, a lot of this I think is probably better off overall. Things will have to change. And yeah, providing good interfaces to people. It's very complicated to use Bitcoin right now. And I think that needs to change. And there'll be people that'll be doing that and making money at it. So that's the condensed version. I could talk about it more. I'll be around all night. So that's it. Check me out online.
We've run just a little bit over, so we'll get everybody out of here. On behalf of Wildcard, I'd like to thank Mr. Bagley, DeRose, and Mao for participating with us. They come a long way with very busy schedules. I'd like to thank all of you for taking your time out and attending. I think on behalf of the panel, I'd like to applaud your endurance. Most of us will be here for the duration, and of course would welcome continuing conversation on any of these subjects with everybody. Are there any outstanding questions, anything that we ought to take care of here while we have everyone in the room? No, I didn't imagine so. I think everybody's pretty itchy to get going. I believe the reception starts 5 minutes ago upstairs, is it? Somebody know for certain? I believe there's a reception upstairs.
I think it's a couple of doors down.
Or a couple of doors down. I'm losing track. I don't live in this building. But thank you, everyone. Thank you for coming. We appreciate it.